Great to see folks. We're not going to do a roll call today, so we'll just capture. So for anybody joining late, they won't have to feel the shame of the silence of their name as I go through the order. But we have a lot to cover today. It's an exciting meeting, so I'm going to move us right into it. So if you can go next slide. So before I walk through the agenda, I'll just remind folks of we have closed captioning made available, so you can either click on the CC button, show captions on the bottom of your screen if that's helpful for your participation. I see lots of RAC members on camera today. Appreciate that. To the extent that you can stay on camera, that's incredibly helpful. For members of the public, if you're interested, we do have public comment. As you can see at 10:30, approximately 10:30, we'll open up for any public comment. And then this is a Zoom meeting, so any members of the public, we'll ask you to keep your cameras off, to stay muted and not to use the chat. As always, Anita will be supporting chat, as well as DLCD folks tracking comments that come in through that mechanism. Which will be helpful for our conversation today. So as you see on the agenda, we have a lot to move through. This is an exciting part of this process. So we will start with the racial equity framework and draft impact statements. Looking for feedback, and we'll organize that really to hear from multiple different perspectives around those impact statements, and then move into the first part of our proposed rules conversation around capacity and urbanization. As I mentioned, around 10:30, we'll open it up for public comment. So for those that are interested from the public in providing input, we'll describe that process in more detail at that time. We'll build a break-in, and then we'll move into the proposed rules related to housing actions. Then we'll talk about some closing, next steps, timelines for additional feedback, and get you out of here by noon. If you go next slide. And then just recognizing, today, when you have rules on paper, my expectation, and certainly I think the agency's expectations that, once you see those rules on paper, we will hear more interest-based perspectives. And these guidelines then today become especially relevant as we have robust discussion and potential disagreement. I'm also just going to note as we go through this conversation, it's not a meeting guideline, but it's an ask, is that we're going to try to keep people from going too deep into the weeds. There are mechanisms to give comment on very particular and in-depth notes that you may have, but I'll try both for RAC members and I'll look at my DLCD agency folks here as well, not to kind of get down into that space. So if it go in there, I'm going to try to pull us back up. So just ask for your grace in doing so. So as we have this conversation and go through this discussion today, really trying to learn and listen to each other, to try to understand the multiple perspectives in this room, to maintain a respectful, candid, to be constructive, to give feedback that is actionable, that the agency can hear and move on. If there are differences, and do you all have the ability to seek resolution, to find common ground, of course, that is always helpful as the agency is kind of moving these rules forward in this process. There's not really a way for you all to have breakouts and do it in isolation, so I'll just skip that, but please bring things into the room to avoid surprises. As always, you can submit comments by emailing housing.dlcd@dlcd.oregon.gov. And the subject include owner rulemaking -RAC, followed by either for DLC staff only or for public comment. You can go to the next slide. So Ethan, I'll ask you to kind of talk about what we're going to do today.
Thanks, Ben. And just for the record, my name is Ethan Stuckmeyer. I manage the housing division here at DLCD. The goals of this meeting today are real simple, to share with you and discuss with you the proposed rules. Now that you have all of them at your fingertips, or all the proposed rules as they're drafted in your packet, to discuss. We've also got one, I'll call it kind of administrative element of this conversation today, which is to kind of go through these impact statements. Anita will pause on particularly the racial equity impact statement, but would love to hear your feedback on all three of these, the fiscal, housing, and racial equity impact statements. And I did also want to mention, you know, this is a lot of information that we sent to you just, 6, 7 days ago. So definitely appreciate the volume that we sent your way and the possible, the likelihood that you haven't had a chance to digest all of it quite yet. So we're hoping to have this meeting today as an opportunity for you all to share any feedback that you have, but also just want to highlight the other mechanisms, which are to provide written commentary to DLCD using that email address, but also utilizing the technical advisory committee process that we've got, where we will dive into the weeds and we will have those conversations. So, and even, this is all leading towards that October 1st publication at the Secretary of State. But again, that is not where the conversation ends. Feedback, commentary, opportunities to discuss further happen even beyond that October 1st, all the way up until November 7th, when the close of the public comment period happens for these rules. So today is one of those milestones, but is not the finish line, is all I wanted to mention. So looking forward to the discussion today. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Ethan. So let's go to the next slide, and I'll pass it to Anita to open up this conversation.
Thanks, Ben and Ethan. Good morning, everyone. Anita Kaylani Yap. I am the racial equity consultant. You've probably seen me several times, but I'm here to review the racial equity framework and the draft racial equity impact statement. You've heard us talk about this over the last every meeting, and so what I want to point out today is that this racial equity framework for decision-making memo is a complete review of what we've talked about. So we want to make sure we're going to go over it quickly, but have some discussion points with you, and then also the draft impact statement. So do we have the next slide? Does it show the framework here? So again, this is a framework with these 8 different categories, and just again to talk about historical inequities. And I'm going to point you to the memo. It's a 17-page memo, and there's certain points in there. So the historical inequities, talking about capacity and urbanization, and also the housing production strategy. So there's a category for each of these categories. There's these 2 descriptions that DLCD staff has done a really great job of covering. And then I'm just going to go through real quickly benefits and burdens, which is on page, if you want to follow along with me, 5, which covers topic area under UGB amendments, BLI methodologies, development ready land, LUEMs, and then talking a little bit more about that. There's also coverage of data equity and data justice about how we're going to categorize and collect data as we do this work here. There's a fuller memo on community empowerment and engagement. And then under decision making, again, some specific scopes about, excuse me, notification and invitation for tribal consultation as well, which is kind of a new thing that folks are having to do these days. And then restorative justice relating to how these rules will address inequities from a longer term in communities. And then measuring and evaluating outcomes. So this is really an important memo and report to the commission. As part of this discussion, I'm going to go through the racial equity impact statement really quickly, and then really would like to have some conversation amongst housing advocates, housing developers, cities, and other agencies involved, in particular on some specific concepts and things that have been brought up. So I'm going to move real quickly to the memo of the racial equity impact statement. And as we've mentioned, this is a requirement as of January 1st, 2022. And so the issue is related to requirement of this statement being submitted to the Secretary of State. and what I want to focus on in particular is the when we're talking about the racial equity impact statement, this statement is required as a statement to identify how the adoption of the rule will affect racial equity in the state. And then to add on to that, DLCD's housing defines equity in housing as addressing housing needs that goes beyond estimating number of needed units or making them affordable. So people who have unique housing needs based on their specific circumstances. In addition, Oregon's historically marginalized and underserved population often face challenges in accessing safe, accessible, and affordable housing in communities of their choice um, due to unfair historic policies and practices. The Housing Division focuses on creating equitable housing outcomes by facilitating housing production, affordability, and choice, which aligns with Goal 10, principles of fair housing and the urgent housing needs of Oregonians today. So this impact statement covers just the summary of the rule intent. Again, like the topics of related to contextualized housing need, housing capacity analysis, development ready land inventory, housing production strategies, urban growth boundary refinements, and statewide monitoring and accounting. So this is pretty comprehensive rulemaking y'all been in, and this is just a quick summary in particular on racial impact. So this memo covers impact on engagement, also racial equity data considerations, in particular unintended impacts and consequences. And we're going to have further discussion on this in particular. So that was a quick highlight of the coverage of this, but also what I'd like to have some discussion on with these folks, and I can type in the kind of questions. But the first one is related to, it seems to be a good opportunity for folks to talk about benefits and burdens and also unintended consequences. And what I'd like to talk about in particular and have folks talk about, but for the benefits and burdens and also unintended consequences, in particular on your representation on the RAC. So we have housing advocates, we've got affordable housing developers, we've got community members. We also have cities that are also implementing this. So to provide that opportunity for all of you to have a quick opportunity to discuss, in particular, unintended consequences and benefits and burdens. And so at this point, I'd like to open up this conversation within those kind of topic areas. But maybe before I do that, we have Vice Chair Alan Lazo here, who was one of the kind of authors and initiators of the racial equity framework. If you want to share anything with the RAC related to these impacts and frameworks that will be submitted to the commission.
Thanks, Anita. Yeah, and really appreciate the work that the team has done overall throughout the whole process around the racial equity work. And I think particularly now that we see it coming, really coming to fruition and seeing it on paper and seeing these analysis, I think they're really, really fantastic. And I really like the way that it gets broken down into the different areas of the framework. So I'm really, really anxious to hear from folks from all different perspectives, how it has played out for you and from your particular perspective, from the way that you're looking at this program. I also do appreciate that it's that we need to think about these things programmatically and across the full spectrum of folks who are impacted, whether or not you are implementing this work or you are impacted by the work. And so we recognize again that there is a full spectrum of folks that are on that spectrum. And so we'd love to hear from all of those folks. And so again, really appreciate the work that you've done, Anita, and that the department has done around this topic. I think it's really fantastic work. I haven't had a chance to dig fully into the memo. I did look at the racial impact statement and had a quick question about it, but I'll save that until after we hear some other comments from folks. So thank you so much, Anita and the team.
Okay, well, should we dive in? Okay, and I'll come back to you, Vice Chair, with your question. So maybe start with, I'll just say non-jurisdictional. So I wonder for all of our non-jurisdictional folks, and you did a good job of kind of laying a foundation for the conversation. So benefits and burdens, unintended consequences. Love to open it up for kind of city actors, non-jurisdictional actors, and then really want to then shift the conversation to hear from those who would be some of the implementers, as you will. Remind folks, there's a raise hand button. You could also use your human hand. So I'd like to invite folks in.
Maybe I can prompt folks in particular, related to a lot of the rules here. There's kind of streamlined process, which could mean less opportunity for engagement, in particular for non-jurisdictional folks. And, access to decision making could be an unintended consequences, and benefits and burdens. Of course, the benefit is that, housing will happen faster. So kind of to frame that for, the non-jurisdictional folks, what are some comments or concerns that you might have around that in particular?
Vice Chair?
Thanks, Ben. I thought, since it was a little quiet, I'll go ahead and jump into my question. And I think it really is, it really kind of follows from the benefits and burdens and unintended consequences piece, because I think when we talk about displacement from the potential actions, we're very often, I think, thinking of them as unintended consequences. I think that my hope is that that's not an intentional outcome, but very often it happens. And so, Anita, in the memo, in the racial equity statement under unintended consequences, the second line around displacement, and I like this matrix. I'm curious about the statement and the framing under mitigation measures, where it says require tenant protections, right to return policies, community preference programs, and disposition of public land for affordable housing. And I'm curious about it because of the framing of require, and where that really does come into the rules, particularly under the draft proposed rules, where there isn't a compliance pathway that actually requires cities to put that in their compliance pathways. My assumption is that it's probably a reference to the contextualized housing need, and that if a city had identified those potential impacts, then they would be required to address them. I think the word required is strong there. I think we have heard from the department that their intention is to hold folks accountable for those identified needs. But again, if it's an unintended or unrecognized consequence, I'm not sure how we would hold somebody accountable for hold somebody accountable up front for that if we actually haven't identified that as a consequence. So kind of a long diatribe about that. And it really is connected to the framework when we get to the draft proposed rules about not having a compliance pathway for some of those kinds of elements.
Good question, Vice Chair Lazo. I'll hand this over to DLCD staff. This is one of their matrix that I used as well. So who would like to handle that?
Celestina, I invite you to jump in if you'd like to.
Yeah, I can do my best. I've actually been out for the last few weeks. But I think that your comment is accurate, Vice Chair, in the sense that there's no specific compliance pathway requirement to have any companion actions, is a term that we've begun to use, that mitigate unintended consequences of any kind, including specifically displacement, which is one of the most common consequences, as you mentioned, intended or unintended, of some of the housing actions that we are all striving to implement. So a very critical piece. The elements of the program that do have a more overarching requirement are that we have a directive to affirmatively further fair housing, and we have a directive in the housing production strategy to analyze benefits and burdens of all actions and to create a holistic strategy that includes actions that are mitigating burdens and ensuring that that analysis understands who is benefited and who is burdened. That all being said, as I started, your inquiry and your note about the fact that there is a different paradigm for those companion actions than there are for the land use efficiency measure actions in the compliance pathway still, I would say, is an accurate understanding of the program. And if other folks have thoughts and opinions about how that plays out with regard to truly implementing what we are charged to do, definitely want to hear that from folks.
Thanks, Celestina. And sorry, I'll just jump in real quick. And I also see Shannon's hand. Really want to hear from you also. Just a moment, really hold up and highlight what Celestina said there about this being, there remains this really critical obligation within the program to, for jurisdictions to really critically analyze how they're approaching this type of issue, and that these pathways that we're presenting here are only one part of that response. So while there isn't a compliance pathway for that, that doesn't mean there is not an obligation to do that, and an accountability structure to ensure that cities are doing that. But yeah, I also very much agree with Celestina that, if we, if pulling these two sort of sections apart in that response strikes folks as introducing some issues in terms of of what that follow-up looks like. Definitely very interested and open to hearing about that. I'll hand it back to you, Alan. I think you had a response.
And I just want to say thanks for that. And I agree with what you're saying. I think, again, the word require, to put it on the same footing as the others, I think, and again, it's really hard to capture that in 20 words in a table. But I just wanted to bring that forward. And also, I guess I'm also curious a little bit about the mechanism in the programming. Again, the folks that are here in the room and are here in the department now have this commitment to ensure how that programming works on the non-loom side. Without it being in a compliance pathway, could it be interpreted differently if we had a different set of folks, a different environment? That's my concern. Without having an actual compliance pathway, do we potentially lose that? It's hard to say that from where we are in the rules, but again, that's to me the benefit of having a compliance pathway defined is it's defined. Right now, what we have is a commitment and an understanding about where we've come from and where we're trying to get to, but it isn't spelled out clearly in the compliance pathways.
Right. Thank you. Shannon, you've gone up and down a few times.
Yeah, I'm eagerly listening. Thank you, Commissioner Lazo, and thank you, Celestina and Thea. And just, I guess I want to just vocalize that I'm kind of sitting here in a place of joy. I'm thinking of how far this collective work has come, maybe over something like, I don't know, I want to say 6 years. And the fact that these kinds of dynamics and land use planning are being so very specifically named is a win. Like, that's a win in the first place. And I think that this chart is exciting. I kind of want to see the next iteration of this chart, or I guess this is my encouragement just would be that charts like these are works in progress. And to Alan's point, I do love the compliance pathway idea, but if this is the mode of operations and how DLCD is seeing this work and getting things done, that's exciting and encouraging. And I think these charts, with experience and expertise and focus, right, would in my mind, like grow and become enhanced over time with on the ground experiences and acumen. And I think that that's really important too. Like this is a chart, it's not comprehensive, but this commitment to this kind of lens and land use planning and who has access where to certain amenities and how do we make sure affordable housing isn't just at the fringes. Like these are really, really exciting things to uplift. So I really wanted to say thank you.
Thanks, Shannon. Mary Kyle?
I'm just chiming in because you need some contributions, but I also feel like since I'm a member of the HOG and the COTAC, I feel like I'm kind of repeating things, but so I just held back. But I'll agree with Shannon and Alan that this is incredible progress. But on some of it, I just need to see more details. So for example, ensuring that UGB expansions include affordability provisions. That's a big lift because that hasn't been the way in which UGB expansions have traditionally developed. So it's like, how are we going to guarantee that and to make sure that we have density and affordability and accessibility pathways, as Commissioner Lazo mentioned, that we don't have, and I see some hesitation I've seen some hesitation to ensure that there's densities that would at least make it possible to qualify for federal funding for affordable housing or to achieve accessibility, the minimal accessibility requirements that currently exist. So it's kind of like the devil's in the details that I'd like to see how these are going to play out. I'm less worried about affordable housing being at the edge than I am about unaffordable housing being what's in our expansion areas and they becoming kind of exclusive enclaves. So, but there's good words here, and it's just more like I need to see the specifics, and I think we're just going to see how this plays out. So again, some more compliance pathways on affordability and accessibility, and just ensuring the density provides the ability for affordability and accessibility too. Thanks.
Thanks, Mary Kyle. Shane?
Thank you so much. I just want to mirror what Shannon said, that I'm very grateful and excited about all the work that went in here. I was surprised that the racial equity framework was not one of the starred documents because I thought it was excellently done and had some really good insights that I felt were really important. So I will admit, I think we've talked about 7 or 8 different topics. So I'm just going to narrow it down to what I feel is like probably, I think, in the mode of the conversation we're having. I do have to state that I will always have respect and deference to the fact that we're living in a wildly flipping federal climate. The market is going cattywomp. It feels like regulations versus what we're allowed is bonkers. And hey, if you allow a trans athlete girl on your high school, your state may get no more federal funding, right? So let me just state in terms of my experience of being a trans person currently in the society, what I see is in the best of circumstances, we are 1 or 2% of the population. That is a fact, no judgment. And then in a best circumstance, if we own proportionately housing, we would still only have 1% of the housing market. So when I think about the questions within the racial equity framework, especially within the contextualized housing need, I think that it is so highly important that the qualitative and quantitative needs are marbled together to consider how we're going to idealize our goal and framework, understanding that we will not get everything accomplished that we do. However, there's an existential comment with that. If we cannot accomplish everything, who will be the sacrificial lamb on the negligence altar? We know that this market for decades, if not for hundreds of years, has produced the results we've had. My profound and deeply impacted statement is, I view the market's realities as being synonymous with my oppressors. I am not holding the property. The people who own markets and who decide government and who currently are ransacking our federal reserves with the ideas of dogs running through and wild bulls. And none of this is centered on my needs. And even before this wild political climate, I've always had to have housing filter down because I've never made an income that's more than poverty. So when it comes to my experience as a low income renter who has been displaced 10 times in 5 years, and also someone who's trans and HIV positive, I really want to encourage everyone to just really center the fact that whom are we serving? Whom are we willing to sacrifice? And why are we so deferential to a market that is synonymous with oppression, that is synonymous with really singular topologies? And when I went to the check-in yesterday, and I'm really appreciative, so shout out to the people that were there. What I ended up understanding is at the end of the day, it's like there will always be an emotional consideration of what housing is, and it always needs to be centered on the fact of whom are the least of what you're serving. And for me, I think the entire process of the racial equity framework married with the entire ONA process has enough self-reference and checkpoints that I feel that in the generalized process, even the least of us or the smallest of us will eventually be considered in some way or another. I just hope that any community who feels that they need to be named are named on these documents, say the LGBTQ community, and I highly impress. I just don't care about single family housing anymore. I do not care about traditional modes of ownership because those traditional modes of ownership have led us to the situation we are. So when people fear change, I have had change every day of my life since I've come out as a trans person. And there are changes that were incurred upon me by my society that I did not consent to. But I put my big girl panties on and I realized that I can't change the entire world. I can change me. And I can further change by increasing people's imaginations that just because you live in a single family home, that doesn't mean that's appropriate for everyone. Maybe you want to live in a suburban topology. There's 76% of our land mass that's zoned and built where you can have that option. We do not need to serve you anymore. And I really impress everyone. Be empathic with change, but be piss and vinegar about the fact that we need to scooch our butts because we haven't been scooching our butts for years and not everyone's been served. And that's my experience only as a trans person. So I cannot speak for other communities, but in my experience of my community, I see the fractal observations about how this market will never be equal until we have a robust social and public housing system and we disincentivize the idea that housing is not a human right. Those are my feelings and views. And I thank you for letting me cook and taking that amount of time.
Thank you, Shane. Anna, you had a hand up and then it went down.
Yeah. I'm like, thank you for sharing, Shane. Very impactful and agree with what you were saying. I think another thing related to that I was thinking about with the racial equity framework of like it's really good to have because yes, it's still something new, but I think it really like asks the questions in the process that need to be asked in the beginning as we're developing housing. And then I think can also really shine light of where gaps are. So even if it's not like the most perfect thing, I think it's still really great to have to move forward. And as housing is being developed, to really include the folks who need to be included, to ask the questions that weren't being asked before, and highlight the issues that communities are facing and when it comes to accessing housing and being able to do that. So I think even though it's like not the most perfect and doesn't have like the compliance pathways, it's still good to have in us developing a new framework for how we're viewing and building housing in our state.
Awesome. Thanks, Anna. We're a bit over time already, unfortunately. I'm going to ask like if there's other comments on the racial impact statement, throw them in the chat if you would. If there's any burning comments on either the housing or fiscal impact statements as well, I'd love just to give a moment of opportunity for those. Okay. Now I realize it feels weird to kind of rush us off this topic, but do want to make sure we can hit some of these other ones. So please put it in the chat. We will capture if there's other thoughts. That'd be wonderful. So I think Maddie, did I see you here?
Everyone.
Yes,
Hi, Ben.
I see you now. Okay, jump in.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks, everyone. Good morning. appreciate the very thoughtful and meaningful comments that were just shared. I'll be talking a little bit more about some policy direction around urban growth boundaries. In particular, we're at the point where we're talking about options that cities have to work with, how they operate the expansion process, and what helps a city determine where and how they grow to meet a housing need. So this won't be a step-by-step overview, but rather more of a high-level summary that helps you all, RAC members, engage on the topics, just knowing that everyone comes to this set of topical conversation with different levels of understanding. And there are invariably areas that will have greater detail or need greater detail that you can certainly offer in response to some of the prompts, but we're going to stay high level for the purposes of this conversation. Once we build understanding around the concepts, there are a set of meaningful questions this group can discuss to help us complete rulemaking on the topic, because it's not just mechanics. And if it was, we would do our rulemaking process quite differently. So some questions to think through or continue to mull over while I'm making this presentation are: what are the ways that cities have flexibility and latitude to consider how and where they grow? What are some of the safeguards that guide cities to urbanize in specific ways? And what are the outcomes that the Oregon land use system seeks to engender in this process? So if you could move on to the next slide, please. So we'll start where we left off, which at your last RAC meeting, around land use efficiency measures. This is a familiar graphic, and albeit very simplified. You'll know that cities use efficiency measures in a lot of different ways to meet their housing need. In this case, land use efficiency measures might be responding to the way a city wants to pursue a compliance pathway, which you'll hear about in the second half of our meeting today. A city may adopt a land use efficiency measure in response to residential capacity deficit that's identified in their capacity analysis. It might also respond or be required in the selection of actions in the process of developing a housing production strategy. But basically, there are a variety of ways that cities use efficiency measures, and it's important to remember them because they'll come into play later in this process diagram that I'll build as we move through the different slides. But for the purposes of our conversation today, we're really looking at cities that identify a residential capacity deficit in their housing capacity analysis. Also, just some terminology. I'll describe something called land prioritization. It's a component of Division 24. You'll see in some of the packet materials all the way down there in subsection 67. And this is a system that promotes urbanization of land that is currently in urban use. So, for example, exceptions to our dichotomous rural-urban set of rules in the statewide land use planning system, among other stratification that's based on soil type and capacity for farming and forest uses. So it's a little bit confusing, but those lands that are more geared towards urban use are prioritized in the urbanization analysis process, whereas those lands that are really most valuable to the state of Oregon as resource land for a variety of other uses are deprioritized or down the prioritization scale. And I just wanted to make sure that everyone followed that, because I know that's something that I often need clarification on. Next slide, please. So a city declares that they've done everything they can to make the best use of land that they have available to them within their existing urban growth boundary through land use efficiency measures. And you'll remember from our work around Division 8 in our last conversation that this refers to actions taken by a city through land use regulation that is consistent with ORS 197-610 that quantifiably reduces the land need. So this is a city declares they have a need. Now they've taken efficiency measures to try to make the best use of land they possibly can. And this could, most importantly, reduce land need in calculating the scale of a UGB expansion or swap. I just wanted to plant that as background information in folks' minds. Next slide, please. Now the next step is establishing a UGB study area. So what stays in? What's ruled out? So we don't want to ask cities to spend an inordinate amount of time analyzing land that's never going to provide the levels of urbanization that we're hoping to achieve in a growth boundary amendment or swap. So a city does a very prescribed process, and importantly, we're not DLCD staff is not recommending study area consideration changes in rule right now, but we have been able through the TAC process to highlight areas that have a fair amount of confusion or a wide range of interpretation. And we're hoping that in some ways, through guidance and maybe some clarification in rule, that we can help clearly delineate the reasons why land cannot be included in a UGB study area, especially land that's of the highest priority. So that land that's ready or most likely to help a city adhere to some of the principles of the statewide land use planning program. So a city includes land that's within a 1 mile radius of its existing UGB. Sometimes that includes land that's hemmed in by a variety of hazards and other challenges. But we're moving towards a framework where a city could either discount that or avoid that area because perhaps that area is riddled with challenges that make that land really truly unsuitable per the definition of that in buildable land in Division 8. And we know that at the end, a city must have at least 2 times the amount of land that it needs. So let's say it declares a deficit of 100 acres. The study area must be 200 acres in size. So there's sufficient choice among sub areas. Importantly, land that's unsuitable. So you heard my colleagues talk a little bit about this at our last few meetings. Land that has hazard risk, land that is impracticable to serve. So imagine some significant barriers like in some cases the Willamette River, Interstate 5, some really prominent physical characteristics of the land that make whatever land that is eligible unlikely or not effective cost-wise to be served. And this is an area that we're exploring and hopefully to provide a little bit more clarification on that term impracticable. It's fairly well spelled out in Division 24, but we find that there's a fairly wide interpretation of that terminology. So just know that there's not proposed language changes in rule, but we're hoping to enhance our common understanding of what some of those challenges and reasons to rule land out look like, either through some clarification of wording and or guidance that will emerge after we finish rulemaking. Let's move on to the next slide. So a city goes through establishing a study area. Now it must compare areas of potential opportunity for urbanization through the Goal 14 location factors. And you'll see those highlighted on the screen in front of you. They are very broad and open, and all factors are considered equally. So cities have a lot of latitude to determine balancing things like efficiency with economic and orderly provision of public facilities, and potentially even especially comparing some of the consequences. So environmental, energy, economic, and social consequences of bringing land in, as well as compatibility with farm and forest uses outside of their urban growth boundaries. So minimizing conflicts, comparing consequences, and then all of the efficiency and orderly considerations that cities might use to compare sometimes up to 10 or 12 sub areas that are often in chunks or delineated by letters and numbers on a map. I apologize for not having a great visual here, but those sub areas are sometimes between 75 and 100 acres in size. So each of those sub areas are say 100 acres, and a city must compare them all and balance them in identifying which ones are most suitable to produce urban outcomes. And those urban outcomes in our context are the production of housing. What you'll see in the packet materials is that staff is recommending retaining these location factors as they are. These are in the goal language, and providing some guidance and refinement that may help their interpretation be more clear. We just really want to make sure that we're providing cities enough flexibility to really recognize their own context. And we tend to believe that cities have a lot of that local knowledge and contextual knowledge that helps them balance the different opportunities they have in selecting a sub area or several sub areas for inclusion. Now a city decides how they will make an urban growth boundary amendment. We'll move to the next slide, please. So there are two types of amendments, really generalized. One is a swap, which removes some land from the existing UGB and adds land that's equivalent into the growth boundary. So we know that there are some areas that have been in cities' urban growth boundaries since they were adopted in 1973 or shortly thereafter, when cities produced their first comprehensive plans for acknowledgement. There's a lot more information we know now about some of those properties or some of that land that make them not great candidates to urbanize. However, we understand that urban growth boundary amendments are absolutely necessary as long as cities' population is forecasted to grow, but it may come with some cascading impacts, and so we take them quite seriously. We know that not all the land can be accommodated by swapping land out that may not be suitable. So we acknowledge that the next step after considering those other options, land use efficiency and potentially swapping land, is to expand the growth boundary. And expanding the growth boundary means that land that's in the existing UGB stays the same, but potentially a city adds land to cure the deficit that's identified in their capacity analysis. Not all housing needs can be met within the city's urbanizable footprint. So we're hoping that rules that you see in your packet and some of the suggestions that you'll offer today can help cities reduce the analytical burden that it takes to expand and or swap land within a UGB, that there is clarity and relative certainty that after reviewing all those Goal 14 factors, their community can grow without experiencing challenges that come with land constriction. So some of those unintended consequences we'll ask you to emphasize and highlight, and that there are trade-offs that come with both UGB amendments, both in swapping or expansion. And we'll move to the next slide, please. And Anita, I do see your hand. I'd love to come back to you right before we go into discussion, if that works for you. There are trade-offs between the idea of swapping and expansion. So a swap can remove land that's not likely to develop. It's a land that a city carries that they know they're not going to achieve the outcomes of urbanization that are intended for it. And frankly, every time they move through a buildable land inventory, they have to count the capacity of that land, knowing perhaps full well that that land isn't likely to produce that capacity, and therefore the capacity is not a true representation of their urbanization or urban potential. And so removing that land may help UGB analysis like buildable land inventories be more accurate or more accurate representation. A swap, however, is not an expansion of net acreage. So you'll see that rule changes we've suggested actually make it possible to exchange land that has no development potential. So for example, hazard land or unsuitable land with information we now know, to conversely include land that has development capacity. So we've got 10 acres of land that's all in a hazard zone that's now I can rule out and say is unsuitable. That land could be exchanged for 10 acres that have development potential. So there is a net gain of urbanizable potential or development potential of doing a swap, even though the land area is the same. However, there's also the opportunity to do a UGB amendment to meet a jurisdiction's needed housing per the housing capacity analysis, and that follows the land prioritization scheme and the analysis that follows that. We're hoping that the opportunity to both swap and potentially amend a growth boundary, which both may be appropriate for a community, that we're able to see cities meet their housing needs as identified in their housing capacity analysis. With the combination of land use efficiency measures, UGB analysis, and the study area, and ultimately amendments to the growth boundary, DLCD staff is hopeful that cities can effectively and efficiently direct a growth strategy that helps cities meet housing needs within the planning period. And so we can move into the next slide, and Ben, I'll hand it off to you. I'll touch on Anita's hand, and I see another hand also, but I wanted to put this slide up just so others can be thinking about it. From your experience in the variety of ways you all engage with housing policy and growth, we'd like to understand what we don't know. Are there certain key policy considerations, equity considerations, other statewide planning goals, some unintended consequences that this process creates, how the process can best balance some of the statewide planning goals, and potentially even thinking about what areas are really tripping up cities in doing this work in a timely way to effectively achieve housing production, affordability, and choice. And with that, I'll turn to Anita, please, and try to answer any questions you may have.
Thanks, Maddie. This question actually was from Ann Kelly, and I kind of lost the context because it was earlier in the presentation, but it was a question about impracticable. And Ann, can you just wanted to know if the definition was going to be clear and objective? And maybe Ann, you can add to the context.
Yeah, thank you, Anita. Yeah, I was just referring back to a point that Madeline made about the use of the impracticable definition, and I'm not sure how far we'll have to take clear and objective in terms of what we end up with locally, but it's always nice when the state standards can begin in a clear and objective way for us to move forward for the state.
And I appreciate you raising that, because I think impracticability is starting to be more present on cities' radars, knowing especially that there has been land included in cities' urban growth boundaries that is not cost effective to serve or won't produce the outcomes that a city intends. There are some very clear criteria in Division 24, subsection 65, which describe what is impracticability. And there are also some LUBA cases that describe how the courts have interpreted impracticability. The key to impracticability is that it is rooted in physical characteristics of the land that don't change. Some of those have cost outcomes, so secondary impacts are cost or complexity to serve, for example. But what's important about impracticability is that, especially as defined in that subsection 65, is that there are certain physical characteristics that are really difficult for a city to overcome. And in that way, I think a city can be fairly objective in determining what is more subjective and perhaps more difficult to alliterate to maybe the satisfaction of all cities, is that there are such a wide range of characteristics that factor into that impracticability standard that I don't know if we're likely to find a succinct, say, punch list of things that if it meets this, if it meets this, if it meets this, then it is impracticable. But it is certainly something that the capacity and urbanization TAC has considered fairly deeply. And if we're able to refine it further before our pencils set down, we will certainly do so.
Thanks, Matt. Does that answer your question, Ann? You're on mute.
Yes, thank you. That's helpful.
Okay, Karen?
Yeah, I was just going to add, and you hit right on the nail of some of the reasons why you don't see rule changes for those divisions, or I'm sorry, those sections in Division 24, 65, and 67. And for those of you that are following along, you kind of see how we worked through this at the TAC level on page 2. And I was into page 3. And I was just going to highlight in your CalTAC memo on page 3 this idea of swapping out land, with which Maddie so eloquently characterized, that there exists, maybe not in every UGB, but in many UGBs, land that for whatever reason was added years, decades ago. Today's environmental regulations just say it really isn't practical anymore. It doesn't make sense why they're in UGBs. But I wanted to highlight 2 things in your memo, and there's just 2 short paragraphs on page 3. What you'll see in the draft rules are trying to accomplish 2 things, and Maddie laid out, why can't we swap this land out for buildable land? Right now, the way the rules are written, it doesn't allow for that, but statutes would allow for it. So we're going to take that flexibility, and you'll see that reflected in the rules. And there's one more thing. We realized that when you swap out, we had a lot of conversations about how do you swap in? So what we're swapping out, to Mary Kyle's point, what's in UGBs often was zoned for large lots, low density residential. Why do we have to swap in at the same? Why not swap out and then swap in with higher densities, different uses? And Mary Kyle, I'm just going to touch on your point that some of the rules speak to complete neighborhoods. Let's change how an urbanizable expansion area looks entirely. Can you have neighborhoods serving commercial corner street markets and mixed use and higher densities and cluster? So I wanted to point to those things. You'll see a little bit in that memo. Thanks for that extra couple minutes.
Thanks, Karen. Mary Kyle?
Thanks. I am fine with how the UGB land swap, where we've come to in the CowTech. But I just wanted to make sure I'm understanding something that seems obvious to me, but I never see it written down, which is the practicality of UGB land swaps, which is really that land that's being swapped out has to really be at the edge, right? I mean, that doesn't really make sense because otherwise, I don't think we're going to take land that's in the middle of it.
Yeah, we didn't change the existing rules around contiguous, adjacent to the UGB. That's
right.
in the
Okay.
existing
So
rules, we maintain it.
Right, that practicality, and then there are lands inside existing urban growth boundaries that are also impracticable to develop, but maybe they get discounted or they're not considered buildable, whatever. I just for those who may not deeply be in UGB world, that's true.
Thanks for pinning that point. Yeah, no donut holes in your UGB. Don't swap out this little island.
Right. And there's also, the issue of, do the owners want it? And, there's some practicality issues of a land swap other than the physical ones. But I also don't want us to lose sight of the fact that there's a lot of cities that are landlocked, for lack of a better word, and who need to be able to have the tools available, including infrastructure investments, to be able to use the land they do have more efficiently, more equitably, and all that. And so I don't want us to high center too much, or I know UGBs is a big issue. I'm not downsizing that, but there's a lot of cities that's not going to be an option for one reason or another, and yet they still have obligations to meet the housing needs of their current and future residents. And so we really can't lose sight of that, because for them, more land isn't the issue, but what is the issue? And I want to make sure that, to the degree that there's things within DLCD's control, that we have those on the table, but also that we're highlighting things that aren't in DLCD's control but need to be, addressed by the state or others, like infrastructure investment, et cetera. So I just don't want to lose sight of that. And then I think the notion of talking about physical impracticalities is good. I was trying to think of talking with someone about how would we, for things that aren't physically impractical but might have some pre-existing development of areas outside UGBs and bringing them in. I really think we have to look at the lands that were first included in the original UGBs, and I think of Happy Valley, which came kicking and screaming into the Metro UGB when it was originally drawn, and I mean that absolutely, because we were involved in litigation on that. And and that was an ex-urban, sprawling rural residential development area. And look at how it's going gangbusters now. I think that tells us that, and that's a rolling hills, et cetera, that the importance of infrastructure investment, that eventually a corner is turned and then a lot more is developed. But that doesn't happen overnight, and it certainly didn't happen in Happy Valley overnight. And I'm sure there's places around every UGB where one can point to that. So anyway, I just wanted to share that because I was trying to think of what makes land impractical simply because it has some pre-existing development on it. And I think it's time and investments that can cure a lot of that. But there are physical impracticalities that make other areas just, not likely to develop or to develop very much. Thanks.
Thanks, Mary Kyle. Let's go Ann and then Brock. Anya. Yep.
I think Brock was first.
Sure, Brock, jump in.
Oh, sure. Mine's a little bit more tangential, so Anne, if you want to go ahead, please do.
Okay, sure. I have a couple points, and one of them is related to what Mary Kyle just raised, and it's also related to what I always bring up about the fact that counties cannot expand outside of the urban growth boundary. We will also have cities annexing our land. But the flip side of that is that there's not just like either efficiency measures or expansion outside the UGB for cities. Many of them, at least in the metro area, can expand into massive unincorporated urban areas that already exist. And these are not just like future development lands in terms of Washington County's land. There's a huge amount of urban land, in low density developed areas. And we have 13 cities partially or totally within our boundaries. So Clackamas County has similar situations probably where cities will annex land that's already urban and won't have to necessarily go outside the UGB. Maybe that's an efficiency measure too, but I just wanted to point out that there's kind of that middle ground for a lot of cities too.
Thanks,
Oh,
Ann.
the one other thing was in terms of the impracticability of developing land that has Goal 5 resources on it. It makes sense to me for land that has water-related Goal 5 resources on it, but it's been, common practice for upland habitat areas, which are Goal 5, to be developed. And of course, there's supposed to be mitigation involved. But there are a lot of urban lands that include Goal 5 upland resources. And, as the easier lots get developed, that is what is left in the end to develop. So that would take a lot of lots probably off the table. And that's it. Thanks.
Appreciate it. Brock?
Yeah, and a broader point that all these rules are going to have a nexus to. I don't know specifically how we should integrate this yet, but earlier this week, or maybe late last week, the Federal Emergency Management Agency released their draft environmental impact statement for the NFIP ESA integration plan for Oregon. And I was going through some of the report, and what it shows is that between 2010 and 2020, around 11% of all housing built in this state was developed within a special flood hazard area. That covers a decent amount of land. In total, I think it's about twice as much land as exists for housing within all cities combined in the entire state. But while I know that in Rule 65, subsection 4, a city can exclude significant flood hazard areas from their study area for a future UGB expansion, what we haven't really touched on is what to do with those areas if one of either alternative 2 or 3 go into place that are currently within urban growth boundaries, and how that capacity gets counted. And the reason that I bring this up specifically here is that looking at this report, they're estimating that with the mitigation measures that would need to go into place to account for new developments in those areas, the average cost of building a new home on, let's just say, a vacant lot, undeveloped lot, not let's just say, that's what their study says, in the significant flood hazard area is going to be anywhere between 20 and 57.6% more expensive than housing that's currently there today. That is a huge cost factor. And while it is not necessarily a restriction that would make the land unbuildable, right, it is something that in practicality, when you're considering the cost inputs of all of this, it's going to make those areas far less likely to develop. On its own right now, that is not sufficient justification to say, hey, we need to account for those lost, essentially non-buildable anymore acres. And again, while we don't know exactly how this is going to go through, they could go with alternative one, which is the no action alternative. But if they go with 2 or 3, there's going to be significant land capacity impacts to that. And I think we need to have something, and I'm not sure exactly what yet, and I can work on that before we reconvene next time. But something that will provide a connection there so that cities, because, you know, especially in Washington County, big problem. There's some cities where it takes up 91%, I think, on the highest end of their UGB is within the significant flood hazard area. So this is going to be a huge problem if one of those 2 alternatives goes through, and we just need to have something in place to be able to have a little bit of a backstop there to protect cities from not having enough.
Oh, Brian, Alexander, before I go, I don't know, DLCD, if you've had a chance to kind of review the EIS. So this is a FEMA flood hazard program. Maddie, did you want to comment?
And everyone, not in specific, but I think one thing that's important to recognize with some of the rulemaking that you've seen already before, not that's been presented today, is that cities will be doing capacity analyses on a far more frequent basis, and will have the ability to look to their UGB in terms of its sufficiency far more frequently than they have in the past. And things like the ESA, the biological opinion and its impact on buildable land will become a factor in the consideration. I think it very well fits within the framework that's described of how a city rules land out of its study area, and then certainly how it continues to evaluate the capacity of land that might come into the study area through those Goal 14 factors. So I think it actually is part of the existing program as it exists. This would just be new information that a city would use to determine certain land is not suitable within the study area.
Right, but for the lands.
I think, Rocky, what you're saying is the land might be suitable, but it's not practical because the cost would be elevated. Is that what you're saying?
Right, and there's already a large portion of lands for a lot of cities that are within the significant flood hazard area and within the UGB. As far as doing a UGB amendment, you can exclude those from the study area, but in terms of what happens with the estimated capacity of those lands that already are within the UGB is what I think.
And those are eligible for a 100% discount existing.
Good, thank you, Maddie. It's good questions. Let's go Brian and then Alexandra.
Yeah, so Mary Kyle's comment had me kind of thinking about, and then Maddie's description of Division 24, and I was just diving in Section 7 and what it is to be impracticable to serve. And those are fairly, I would say that they do run with the land, and most cities don't have a lot of these features, being tsunamis or flood zones, et cetera. And I'm just wondering if there seems to me that there are no proposed changes there that do relate to the cost of services and the cost of infrastructure. And I'm curious if we don't have legislative authority, if there's no direction from existing law that would allow the process to do that. In other words, why not jump into that and try to address that? Is it outside of the scope of the rulemaking? Is it just something that we don't want to touch? Because in my practical experience, in conversations with landowners who are developing in any area, the cost of infrastructure is a really significant constraint in terms of bringing any kind of new economic development areas, new housing online. So my concern is that if we continue a model where lands can be brought into UGBs, but their cost to serve is 5x, 10x greater than other areas, then we are essentially shortcutting and really stifling the ability to bring housing, needed housing, onto the market effectively. And we get into a situation like a Happy Valley where a city is expected to essentially front the money through rates. So this is typically cities raising rates across the board to all residents and taking money out of their pocket in order to then invest that money into an area and spend more money per acre, more to get an area to be viable for development, or else it just sits there and isn't developed. And I think there's some equity considerations in that in and of itself. It's taking money out of pockets. Rate increases take money out of everyone's pockets in order to fund that needed infrastructure. So this comes at a tremendous social cost. And so I'm curious, why is that not being tackled in this process? Or maybe I have it wrong and it is being tackled, but I'm just curious what the discussions were I'm forgetting, we have hogs, we have the hog, and we have the cow. We have all the farm animals. So one of the farm animals is discussing this, but I'm forgetting which one, and I'm curious why we're not seeing changes there.
Thank you, Brian. You've so eloquently outlined one of the inherent challenges of this part of the Oregon land use system, which is that cost typically is in direct contrast to the land prioritization scheme. So there is certainly a desire to see impracticability utilized in ways that allow a city to choose land that is most likely going to satisfy their housing production needs. At the same time, land that is attractive to development and potentially substantially less cost to serve is often flat farmland and therefore has inherent value and resource. So we have cities have a very significant challenge in balancing those two factors. The impracticability standard, just to be clear with all the members of the RAC, is meant to rule out land before it is considered within the sub-area selection process, land that would be added to the growth boundary, knowing that there may be challenges related to service that Brian articulated. What we would like to provide that we have not, I think, provided, we likely don't have the capacity right now or potentially the amount of time appropriate to address. It's been attempted to be addressed in several other instances in our not so distant past. Is what are the criteria or standards of consideration? So when an engineer evaluates land that could be considered in the study area and says, these areas are likely too expensive or too challenging technically to serve in a way that's going to provide cost-effective outcomes. I think we can provide good guidance on that topic, but our ability, DLCD's ability, frankly, to specify the amount of disparity. So is it 2 times the amount of cost that an area needs needs in order to be ruled out, or is it 5 times the cost or more, some exponent of that, to determine that land is truly impracticable? And by determining its impracticability, putting pressure on rural uses and or other resource lands lower down on that land prioritization scheme list to be utilized or considered for urbanization. So the more we push out of existing land that's of highest priority in that prioritization scheme, the more pressure we put on rural lands and their protections and resources. So Brian, you bring up a great point. Why haven't we done it? I think been attempted in several instances. And I think at this point, we might be able to provide some more clarity of what constitutes impracticability. We've been using somewhat of a reasonableness test, which is something that emerged out of land use Board of Appeals cases from the early 2000s of what is reasonable, what is likely or feasible. And those feasibility considerations are things that we'd like to provide examples to cities that they can utilize and say, this is the best method to determining that. But what we can't do, unfortunately, I don't know if we're going to be able to do, is provide what Ann Kelly suggested we provide, which is a clear and objective pathway to land being considered impracticable, at least at this point. And if there's an opportunity to continue to pursue this topic, which I'm sure there will be, I think it's worthy of consideration and continuation.
Brian, I saw a somewhat satisfied nod. Do you have a follow-up?
Well, I mean, we're setting, I look at housing mix and we're setting some pretty bold standards that have mixed factual base and evidence to support them. So like on one hand, I feel like we are doing that in certain parts of these rules. We're hesitant to do it here, right? Pick a number. I'd be like, if it's 10 times more expensive, cool, write it into the rule. You know what I mean? Like any direction is better than no direction in my opinion. And because this does get at, I think, the crux of the matter. Anyway, I appreciate the response and the honest, I really appreciate that. Yeah, thank you. And I understand.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Alexandra, your hand went up and down. You good? You want to jump in?
What Brian and Brock both said really covered all of my kind of questions and concerns. I think for cities, infrastructure availability, practicability, all of that is a major concern in all of this. We can't build housing there if we can't get them sewer, water, etc. So remains a giant question mark for us.
Awesome, thank you. So let's do Kevin, Mary Kyle, and Shane, and then there is a part 2 of this section of the agenda. So I'm going to move us after that. Kevin.
I just wanted to clarify too, part of the conversation at the CowTAC recognizes there's existing language in the current rule. And so this is 0065, section 7, that really speaks to this issue and allows a city to do some analysis on, the likely yield of development, the likely cost of infrastructure. Given that and the fact that markets vary widely statewide, it's tough to say, here's a number where it's impracticable, because that's going to vary. And so I think in part that is why we're looking to develop guidance on this topic. There are certainly some cities who have done pretty extensive work in relation to similar considerations. We'll learn from those, but also hope to develop some guidance that will offer some not safe harbors, but some suggestions for how this could be done under current rules.
Good, thanks, Kevin. Mary Kyle?
I'm just going to push back on the statements that were made earlier that it's somehow always, and that might be a slight oversimplification on my part, but always cheaper to provide infrastructure for farmland rather than non-farmland or resource lands. There's, for example, the South Hillsborough urban growth boundary expansion is almost entirely farmland, and it has a $17,000 SDC premium because of the higher versus the rest of Hillsborough, because of the higher cost of developing infrastructure there. And that's from Echo Northwest report on SDCs. I think that's a great oversimplification. I can point to other areas where there were assumptions by the developers about who was going to pick up the infrastructure cost. They thought it was going to be local governments, and it wasn't. So it's then more on the developer. So infrastructure is needed wherever we're having housing development, and it's an important thing, and it has to be paid for. And it's usually paid for by some combination of ratepayers, who's ever the ultimate, homeowner or renter, the developer, and the state. And in the past, many of us are living in homes where the state or the federal government picked up a lot of those infrastructure costs, and that's just not there anymore. And I think we have to realize that it does cost money to develop new land. Sometimes more than it does cost to redevelop or do infill inside urban growth boundaries. We don't often do that comparison. There's just so many factors that go into how one would do that comparison, including like over time. How much time does it take? Will it take to develop something? And I gave the example of Happy Valley, where at some point there's sufficient infrastructure and there's a tipping point, and then a lot of development happens, but that takes a long time. So I think it's a complex question that also brings in a lot of other policy decisions that Oregonians and the legislature have made, not just about protecting farmland and resource lands, but about reducing vehicle miles traveled and impervious surface to address climate change. So just a lot of values and costs there. So and I think it's just not a simple thing of, is flat land more, is that cheaper to put pipes in than already developed land or hilly land? Thanks.
Thanks, Mary Kyle. Shane?
Thank you so much. This is part of the discussion where I get to hear the nerdiness, where I don't know everything. So thank you all for your intelligence and wisdom. I have two questions. I don't know if you might want to just answer one and then the other. The first is regarding subject areas. If I think of two cities that are both squares, one is a smaller square and one is a larger square. This is just one example. If you have to do 3 or 4 subject area analyses, say those are circles within the square, right? Some squares could have circles where it's 1, 2, 3, 4, and they don't overlap. But then some cities, because they're smaller, the square, those circles may overlap. Is it possible that cities would be allowed to have subject area analyses that do overlap each other, and not in terms of trying to shy away from looking at the analysis, but just being able to say, hey, look, we're really constrained in our square. Our circles of 100 acres are always going to overlap. So maybe there's analyses to see like which circle is going to be the best one. Does this question make sense?
It does, Shane, and I think the clarification is that those circles categorically cannot overlap.
Okay.
So that they are exclusive little pockets of land that are divided up in groupings of between 75 and 100 acres, and it's comparing the merits of each circle. Each circle has to be contiguous to the existing square of UGB.
Okay, and then it's just on that point, is that because it's primarily just pragmatic and or an equity concern? Just because in my perspective, some of those circles may have like this very interesting interlocking relationship where like some of them just have better like opportunities, and depending on the overlap, like say there's just a ribbon of beautifully development ready land and that's like the center, so to speak. Do you know what I mean? I'm just curious as far as the reasoning, just for the sake of being objective and fair to all regions when they have the different squares.
Yeah, you bring up like a great interpretation of the exact challenge that cities have in balancing those location factors.
Okay.
That some areas will have, so not all of those 100 acres in every circle, to use your words, are likely to be prime development opportunity. They come as mixed bags, and so some may have constraints and opportunities, challenges in some places that versus inherent opportunities that, for example, like they tie into the city's utility system really well, or they have certain development opportunities that are unique to them that aren't necessarily present in all the other study area circles. What a city has to do then is balance, is that opportunity in area A worth the trade-off of maybe having steep slopes in that same sub area, or can they choose more than one, so that a city is not bound to only choosing one of the sub areas, but rather they can choose a couple of them or several of them depending on what their land need is.
Awesome.
So a city often goes through this very complex balancing of all those 4 goal 14 factors to determine which of these is the best candidate given all the opportunities and trade-offs that it might present.
Okay, totally understood. And then that leads to my second question, which this is concerning having quantifiable numbers, which are objective, respecting the CHN and disparity between those cities and regions, and objective and explicit language for rules, because I'm hearing that's not my wheelhouse. I am respecting all the people leaping on the mountain, but those seem like those are the constraints, right? Is there already work happening where there's going to be usage of data analysis in terms of adding co-objective variables to visualize the intensity of those barriers? For example, I'm not to make any color worse than the other, but if it's like from blue to red, where there's, say, a cost intensity. So any people who are involved in government who are not involved in the nitty gritty of this process can instantly see, say, in a shared meeting of a city council, we don't have to go through all the nerdy stuff. All I'm telling you is there are red opportunities, not because of redlining, just saying that for the record, but in terms of there is a genuinely objective intensity of cost that can be different. And then this is also, I'm trying to loop this, and I don't know if this is a third condition or just an observation. I'm not trying to be morose, but mortality in the future will truly affect what potential land could be available, especially as family sizes are decreasing or there's different kinds of families. Again, I'm not trying to be summoning death or whatever, but in the next 20 years, the primary single family home topologies that already have serviceable areas and are already development ready land for like further intensity, as time goes on, the Reaper is going to give us potential opportunities to integrate previously privately owned land, I would state. So if there's a subject area analysis that has a lot of SFH, but then you do the numbers and then most of people who own it are over the age of 75, for example. Again, not trying to be mean, not summoning good life and good bounty for everyone, but just I think that's a consideration in terms of a time aspect, because right now, I think so many people are constrained. And so thinking efficiently is not just the present moment, but the potential future soon moment that you could summon in a conversation and see how you could differentiate those resources within the highest and best subject area, which may include those single family topologies.
Awesome. Thank you, Shane. So Brock and David, I'm going to come back to Maddie. Can you go through the next few slides, open up the discussion question, and then Brock, David, I'll call on you first as we open up the next part. I just want to move us into there's a couple more slides and another discussion question for this section.
Karen, I'd love for you to hop right in there. Thank you.
Yeah, Ben, I'm actually going to, for the sake of time, because I feel like we're a little bit over time, I'll direct you to page 3 and 4 of your memo. It's the RAC discussion memo from the CowTAC work, from discussions with CowTAC. And it speaks to urban reserve areas. I will say up front, there was one little piece I left off in this memo, and that was my oversight. So I'll make sure I hit that here in the slides here. But one of the requests that we got from TAC members was to really look at how do we align what the land prioritization looks like. And so we went back to statutes and looked at the statute at 285. And that's really where it lays out, what is the priority for urbanized land? And you were speaking in Washington County that there's unincorporated urban lands and urban communities out there, and what does that look like for potential future growth or parcelized land, whether that's rural residential exception or what that looks like. And then we looked at Division 24, what is the prioritization scheme there, and noted that House Bill 2001 required some changes there, that urban reserves are the highest priority. So what is an urban reserve? A city will establish their 20-year housing need, or DAS now will allocate the housing need, and a city will contextualize that housing need and look at what housing types they need and what they can accommodate with efficiency measures within their urban growth boundary. And then beyond that, if they have land needs, they'll have that urbanizable area or that UGB expansion area. But beyond that, they can plan for an additional 30 years. So they can plan for up to 50 years and hold it in reserves. And why would they do that? It creates a lot of certainty for folks who are developing housing and thinking, okay, where can we develop? What is likely to come in over this generational time of 20 years, even up to 50 years? But it also does a duality of providing assurances for folks who are farming and providing our food. and they need to make investments in their farming land, whether that's irrigation investments or equipment investments. And then they know, okay, these are not in the urban reserve for 50 years, and these are not in the urban growth boundary within that 20-year planning period. We can make those investments doing our agricultural or our forestry or whatever type of resource. And so in that discussion, you'll see that when we looked at urban reserves and went back to what's the prioritization of statute, what's the existing prioritization for lands coming into a UGB that's in Division 24, what should be the prioritization in Division 21? And now I'm seeing that there's a typo right on my slide. Apologies, that third bullet should read Division 21, Rule 30. I just didn't catch it until right this minute. And so you'll see us aligning this priority. I think Rule 30 in Division 21 had 3 prioritizations. The statute under UGBs 197A 285 had 5 prioritizations. What House Bill 2001 did, or the ONA bill did, is it took Divisions 24, Rule 67, and the prioritization there, it went from 4 to 5. So we brought in 5. And Maddie spoke to, how are lands chosen to be brought in? You use this priority scheme. And so you would use a very similar one for urban reserve areas. In addition, we'll go to the next slide, and I'll try to wrap us up here. So you can establish your urban reserve area that allows you to plan for urban growth beyond the 20-year planning period, but into a 50-year. And then that gets complex for all the reasons we talked about. What if in your high priority lands, there are rural residential exception land with these planned developments or subdivisions? So to Ann's point, some county lands, some rural lands have been very urbanized. And what does that look like? And is there an opportunity to deprioritize that because there's development already there and the likelihood of redeveloping it, demolishing it, and putting something new is unlikely? And maybe it's a little more likely to infill there, but it still isn't equivalent to larger parcels, say a 20-acre parcel with a barn and a farmhouse, or just vacant land that is non-resource land. So Senate Bill 1129 in this year's session directed this rulemaking to do 2 things: to give lower priority to that, or to give lower priority in that first category of lands that should come in if there exist planned developments and subdivisions. So you'll see that in the rules. It also asked us to give lower priority to the inclusion of that first category or second category or whatever higher category of lands if urban services are not reasonable or cost effective due to physical constraints. So we continue with that physical constraints, that there's a topography or there's a physical land barrier to being unreasonable or not cost effective to bring in. And so you'll see that as well reflected in the rules. And that's spoken to and talked through on that page 4 of your memo. But then I'll go to the next slide and we start to look at, there's about 15 cities, I believe, there's over a dozen cities in Oregon that have urban reserve areas. And the process to create those urban reserve areas, sometimes they're separate from the UGB amendment process, or sometimes they're together with the UGB amendment process. And what would it look like if, as you're doing your UGB amendment, you're also considering what you might put in reserve? And so I think a new idea has come up in conversations with the project team around that rural residential exception land. That is there any way that a city might be able to pass over due to these circumstances? But then if that rural residential exception land in that category 1 is passed over to bring into a UGB, is there an urban reserve area process that would pick them up and say, well, you at least have to plan for them in your 50-year horizon if you're not bringing them into your UGB now in your planning of your 20-year horizon? All right, so I said a lot of stuff about how cities plan because we've mostly been thinking about a 20-year planning period to meet that housing need that's allocated by DAS. And then what does it look like if we plan for 50 years out? And so the question, and I know we're going to go to David and Brock for any questions you had previously. But if we could go to the next slide and folks can think about this question about why cities plan for urban reserve areas, how does that help both our housing goals, our economic goals, our natural resource goals, and then how do we as an agency use the rules we have, refine those rules to facilitate that longer range planning? So sit with this question, and I'll hand it over to Ben to do our last couple from the previous section.
Thanks, Karen. So David, your hand's down. Do you want to still jump in?
I just had an acronym for Brian for his missing acronym, and for Shane's nerdiness. I just said we could create another committee and call it the Cost, Health, Efficiency, Capacity, Infrastructure, and Needs Committee, which would be the chicken. Thanks.
What a gift. Okay, make note. Thanks, David. Brock.
Yeah, actually, I'm going to tag on to Brian's comment as well. And just note that if we are uncomfortable providing a threshold in rule due to varying local conditions, I think that is reasonable justification to add a safe harbor that if a local government determines lands to be impractical to serve, that they are protected from appeal as a result. Separately related to Division 21, I have a lot of comments here. On the first slide that was shown, it referenced how it's trying to bring in better alignment with 1978285. That is the wrong statute for this. The statute for urban reserves and the prioritization for lands to be included in them is ORS 197A245. One speaks to the subsection 1 of that statute speaks to the intention of urban reserves and the purpose of them, which is to maintain lands for future urbanization. And 6 speaks to the specific prioritizations there, which are developed at urban intensities in a way that makes efficient use of existing infrastructure, right? Looking at development capacity to support a healthy urban economy that can be walkable and served by a well-connected system of streets, right? Can support public schools and other urban level facilities. None of that is reflected in the rule here, and I'm particularly disturbed by the fact that 3, land suitable for an urban reserve may be included within an urban, may be included within an urban reserve only according to the following priorities, none of which reflect those priority considerations that are in the statute there. So while I understand that there is potentially a value concern here from the standpoint of once you bring land that is the most suitable for good urban development, which is what the statute wants you to do, into your urban reserve, now those lands can more quickly be added into your UGB following your next expansion because those are in your first priority lands there. Right. And so I get the concern that if you're not considering these factors on the front end related to, is it marginal land? Is it, low quality farmland? Is it higher quality farmland? Is it super high quality farmland? I get philosophically why there's a concern there, but what the statute is telling these rules to do is not that. Urban reserves exist to support future urban development, not to protect resource lands. Right? So that fundamentally needs to change. I have a red line in the comments that I'm going to submit for all 3 divisions. So I'm more than happy to provide language there. But that's a huge problem. The other pieces on this one, I think the way that the first priority category for planned developments and subdivisions, I think that's actually the way that this rule should be adopted, or at least that provision specifically to mean I don't think we should go in and further define these terms because the first time we tried, it would have precluded this from applying to the area where the senator that introduced the bill directing this was from. So I think it's most appropriate to say, hey, we have kind of a, general, it is common knowledge what these terms mean, at least, within the scope of what we're doing here. So I don't think they need to be further defined. Additionally, in 4A, when we're looking at, moving things up in the priority order because of impracticability to serve with future urban services, defines it as 195.065. That does not include stormwater. I think that's a good reference to cite there, but I think we need to add and stormwater to that to align with the definition of public facilities in Division 8, Rule 5. I think it's like 46 or something like that. Finally, the UGB expansion piece where 80% of land from the original urban reserve has to be added before the urban reserve can be expanded. Again, I don't know what benefit that serves to housing production. It seems to serve to the benefit of protecting resource lands, but again, as the statute very clearly explains, that's not the purpose of these tools. So I think that should be removed altogether. And with that, I'll put my hand down for a while because I'm sure there are a lot of other comments too.
Good. Thanks, Brock. And it sounds like you're prepared with comments that will build off what you just brought in. DLCD, I don't know if there's an immediate response, but you'll get that in writing from Brock. Okay. Well, Brian, and then I'm gonna preview just before you go, Brian. If there's folks that are joined from the public, we are going to open up after Brian's comment for public comment. So if you could raise your hand. If you're interested in providing public comment, that will be the next part of our agenda. Brian?
I'll keep it quick. I did not dive in, but listening to Brock, I would have the same concerns. The statute for urban reserves is its own statute. So these rules should be drafting off of that and his other practical concerns as well. So thanks, Brock. Just another, support those concerns.
Good, thanks. Anne?
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify, Karen was mentioning that she was speaking to a point I made, but when I was talking about urbanized areas in Washington County in particular, I am not talking about rural residential exception lands outside the UGB, and I'm not talking about future development land that's already been brought in, but it has kind of a holding zone on it, limiting its development until it's annexed by a city. So a lot of those are not served yet by services. What I'm speaking to is urbanized land that does have services already. It might be subdivided, but the improvements are aging, the homes are aging. A lot of developers will buy up those lots, consolidate them, and do subdivisions. Or we're seeing middle housing coming in on those properties. And to exclude those lands would exclude everything that we have basically at our disposal for development because, like I said, we can't go outside the UGB. And I just wanted to clarify, we have more land area in our urban and incorporated Washington County area than the city of Eugene. We're roughly the size of Salem in acreage with larger populations than both of those cities. We're the second largest population if we were to be considered a city. So I'm just saying that there is a significant amount of urbanized land that cities can go into and are going into, and that has been the sort of development that we've been seeing for decades here in the county. So I did want to clarify what I meant by that available land that cities can annex. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Anne. So I'm going to formally move us into the public comment period. So if there are members of the public that would like to offer public comment, this is the space in the agenda that we use for that purpose. So if you'd like to provide public comment, you see some directions on the slide. We'll ask you to raise your hand. You'll be given up to 3 minutes to provide input. If you're on the phone, *9 to raise your hand. Not seeing any hands. Nathan. So if you could come off mute, you got 3 minutes, provide public comment, state your name for the record.
Sure. Hi, my name is Nathan Emerson. I'm assuming you can hear me. I'm a planner at CSA Planning here in Southern Oregon. One of my colleagues, Raul Warner, also submitted written comments. So I'd encourage you to look at that as well. But I wanted to make a comment on Division 24, subsection 65(4)B. I'm sure you all have that memorized, but that is the section that includes additional reasons to remove lands from a study area. And specifically, I want to look at wildfire. So, study area is really the first step in the UGB analysis. And a wildfire is a pretty, ambiguous thing to try and evaluate, especially at the local jurisdictional level. So if you look at Jackson County, where we're located, they have an adopted wildfire map, and the things that are outside of that overlay are basically the farmlands, the flat farmlands in the center of the valley. So our concern is that, you know, if cities are allowed to disqualify lands using this wildfire metric, you might be in a situation where higher priority lands, such as urban reserves or exceptions or non-resource, are removed from the study area and in the favor of farmland. And, you know, if that happens, if you remove it from the study area, they don't have to go through the prioritization schema. So you could have a situation where farmland is brought in before existing urban reserves, which have been adopted by the jurisdictions, are brought in before that. So we would encourage that wildfire piece to be, you know, quantified or considered in an objective manner, and really considered as a relative risk to the rest of the study area. I mean, there's really not an area down here that doesn't have some level of wildfire risk. So providing some boards on that would be, we think, helpful. So that's my comment. Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining. Appreciate you. Let's another call for any other public comment for the purposes of today's meeting. Last call for public comment. Seeing none, I'm going to close the public comment portion of our agenda. Folks, we're a little bit behind. I'm going to ask that we just take a 5-minute break. We have a set of slides and discussion for housing actions and want to maximize that time. So if folks can come back at 10:55, get about 5.5 minutes, that'll be great. Thank you. All right, folks, welcome back. 5 minutes goes quick. And I think, Celestine, are you going to lead us into the next section? Thea?
I think it will be me then. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay, well, let's jump right in.
Should we jump in? Great. All right. Thank you. Great to see you all. Thea Croman, she, her pronouns. I'm a housing planner here, and we'll just go ahead and get right in because we have a lot to cover, and I want to try to leave some room for conversation here. So the Housing Actions Work Group has been focused primarily on developing a set of what we are calling compliance pathways through certain elements of the HPS program. You'll remember we brought this to you a couple times throughout the past several months, but it's been a while since we jumped in and really talked through it. So what you'll see here are sort of the initial set of compliance pathways. We're starting here in the contextualized housing need section of the HPS program. And just as a reminder, the sort of high level reminder of what the contextualized housing need does. After a city receives their housing target and allocation from DAS in the year of their HCA, their housing capacity analysis, the contextualized housing need is a set of analyses that reveal nuanced housing need and fair housing issues in a city. So in developing standardized need assumptions in the CHN, there's a potential to really push cities to be more ambitious in what they're planning for. There's also an acknowledgement here that if they're not calibrated correctly, they can really have the opposite of the intended effect or introduce some other unintended consequences. So developing these is delicate. Because of that, there's sort of a range of compliance tools that we're suggesting to apply in different areas. And that's what you see here in this matrix. There's a spectrum of sort of prescriptiveness in the compliance tools, from guidance on the one hand to minimum standards or requirements on the other side of the spectrum. And on the left, you'll see what we have identified as key needs. These are a set of needs that a city can sort of adopt assumptions about, and that's what we'll be jumping into some of the details there. But just at a high level, unit type mix, unit size, geographic location, adaptable and accessible housing, and home ownership are some of the key needs that we've identified. A really important point here is that these compliance pathways, and we addressed this a little bit at the top, Alan made this really good point, these are a sort of a bracketed set of needs that are addressed through these compliance pathways. There remains an entire program through the HPS, through the existing CHN rules that enable and in fact require a city to really do that contextual analysis to understand the rest of the totality of their needs. So this is just one subset of those needs. We can jump to the next slide. I'll start with what we're calling rebuttable presumptions. And again, rebuttable presumptions are one of those tools. They provide a baseline for conclusions in the CHN, but they allow cities to demonstrate that alternative assessments might more accurately identify their true housing need in their community. So essentially ensuring that the program is really heavily incentivizes certain outcomes, but also allows governments to deviate if there's good reason and they're willing to risk some legal uncertainty. Rather than identifying incrementally increased need based on current production, the state's rebuttable presumption proposal here really attempts to identify an aggregate need across the state and pull that out from what the current production levels to actually address what the actual need is. And that's this is a rather, it's a flattening tool. So this is looking statewide, but we're trying to find a balance where this is going to be an ambitious enough standard that it pulls all cities into a greater sort of production paradigm. So for housing type mix, as a starting point, this assumption allocates 40% of that production target for multi-unit need and 20% for middle housing. Acknowledging that there's a connection between affordability and type there, and really that there's a massive need for housing available at lower price points. Accessible need here is set to align with the percentage of folks with ambulatory disabilities. That's rather than keying off of current production levels, looking at what data we actually have to set that standard. We can go to the next slide, and I'll talk a little bit about the safe harbors that are being proposed in this rule. We're looking at the adaptable housing need and larger household housing need. Local governments may adopt these provisions here, and I believe it's section 7, to reduce the analytical burden and achieve some legal certainty in the conclusions in these categories of housing need. So the proposal here is to use the elderly dependency ratio to help establish a need assumption based on some empirical data to identify adaptable need. And this is an attempt to recognize that there's a real underproduction of adaptable housing. Many people will age into needing accessibility features. So it's a rough measure, but it is a way to sort of establish that level of need. I'm just going to keep us moving. It also provides ways to establish conclusions for larger household housing, really by relying on an element that's already a required input in the CHN, which is the housing equity indicators. And I think they can refer to those housing equity indicators. They must refer to those housing equity indicators, they being cities, in doing their CHN. But this sort of provides some credit and certainty for actually referring back to that data set. And those housing equity indicators are published on the Oregon Housing and Community Services public dashboard. For both of these, the safe harbor has cities comparing the regional and local data and proceeding with the safe harbor that takes the higher of those two estimates. We can go to the next slide. All right, so staff are also proposing here that two key needs kind of fall outside of these rebuttable, presumption, and safe harbor tool categories. The first we'll talk about is locational need, really a critical element of the CHN, but also acknowledging here that it's kind of too contextually specific to provide a standardized safe harbor. What the intervention that staff is proposing here is to advise cities through guidance to refer to the community assets and harms mapping tool, which is newly developed, really will be very helpful for cities to analyze a whole set of indicators in terms of assets and harms, and identify areas that are ripe for development versus areas that maybe they should avoid. This is currently in the role as guidance, but we do expect that this to be a required element of any CHN, regardless of whether a city is taking these specific compliance pathways or not. There's also a minimum standard here that was sort of came to us through the legislative session. home ownership was really elevated by HB 2698, which adopted statewide home ownership goals. And so these rules really simply refer to those goals, and we further break them out by income bracket to ensure that we're really emphasizing home ownership at lower income levels throughout the state. And so these will be integrated as a requirement in the CHN conclusions since they're already statutorily required. I think we will move to the next set of slides now, and I am going to hand it off to Sean. Ben, we didn't talk about this. I think we'll hold comments until the end of this section. We have a lot to get through, and I think just to keep us moving, it's probably better.
That makes sense. Thanks.
Discussion. So handing it to Sean now.
Great, thanks, Thea. And yeah, I can take over just to talk or take a little quick detour to talk a little bit about the model code. We've talked about this a while back, so I wanted to maybe just recap a little bit. So the model code is part of a direction that we have to produce and adopt. It's part of Senate Bill 1564, and it directs us to produce some very specific model codes targeted for specific city sizes. And there's different areas of statute, including in that bill and in others, that prescribe different functions for model codes. So basically what we've been doing over the past half a year is working on kind of an initial draft that of the model code that we released in kind of early June. I believe we distributed that to the RAC for review, as well as with our Housing Actions work group. And right now we're kind of in a process of refining that. We've been reaching out to local governments and developers and really just soliciting, well, what are examples of housing that's been built on the ground? And let's stress test this model code to ensure that we're able to achieve a lot of the different production outcomes and different, public policy objectives around things like accessibility and affordability to ensure that this code is achieving the outcomes that we want to do. But in the meantime, one of the additional things that we've kind of done is established a set of administrative rules that kind of operationalize or set out the details of some of those specific statutory functions that are prescribed in different bills. And so I'll cover those just in kind of brief detail, just like some of the main functionalities that we'll get into. There's kind of 4 major functionalities that I'll touch on as we get through these slides. And just as an organizational note, it looks like a lot of rules here, but it was really just kind of a decision like, oh, well, there's 4 different functions in the code. And instead of writing one gigantic rule that's difficult to understand, it kind of makes sense to break out into its own section. So that's why you see all these different pieces like, purpose, definitions, that type of thing in the 400s. So we can move to the next slide. Just again, a really quick note here, and these are kind of operationalizing rules for Senate Bill 1564. This is the bill that says, hey, DLCD, produce these model codes, LCDC, adopt them for these different city sizes and for these different housing types. And so, there's this kind of rule 410 that is like, all right, here are all the model ordinances that we're adopting. We also have model procedures that kind of stitch everything together and make them work. And one of the specific functions in Senate Bill 1564 is the ability for local governments, and this is really specifically targeted for small cities, but it can also work for larger cities, to enable cities to optionally adopt and apply different model ordinances by reference, right? So if a city, especially like a small city, they might not have planning staff, that type of thing, to do full-on code amendments, but maybe they want to allow ADUs. They have something that's provided by the state, it's been vetted, it complies with, any applicable statutes and includes promising practice, and they have the ability to just opt into that through kind of an easy or simple process. And so 415 is basically the rule that clarifies how that works, where it can be applied, how it can be applied, how does it intersect with other different types of land use regulations, like locally applicable land use regulations, public works standards, things like that. And of course, just all those kind of nitty-gritty details of like how a city can actually optionally adopt and apply by reference. And really the goal here is to make that process pretty easy. We don't want to kind of add additional hurdles that make it difficult to adopt and apply by reference. And of course, ensuring we have parameters that it's applying where it's intended to be applied. If we can move to the next slide. The second functionality comes from a different bill. This is Senate Bill 1537 that establishes our office, the Housing Accountability and Production Office. My apologies for using the acronym without spelling it out first. But basically, This is another function that model codes have, which is to help local governments comply with housing laws. I'm sure many of the local practitioners in this room are aware that the laws that govern different housing laws are changing pretty rapidly, and sometimes it can be very difficult to keep up from a capacity standpoint. And so one of the functionalities we wanted to build into these different modules or model codes or model ordinances is the ability for cities to use them to basically readily come into compliance with the housing law through a very simple means. And we're leveraging a statute for the technical nerds out there, that's ORS 197646, which allows local governments to apply statutes directly when their local codes don't conform. And we're basically saying, hey, if you have, if your local code doesn't conform with the housing law, you have this model code that you can apply to avoid a potential violation. Basically, the plan here is that we keep this updated over time. We're actually planning on building on this with additional modules over time for new housing laws, things like the mandatory adjustments, certain things related to by right affordable housing. And the goal here is to provide tools for cities, just an additional option for them to consider that makes complying with housing laws much, much easier. So that's basically the goal for this particular rule. If we can move to the next slide. These next two rules kind of get at the intersection with the Goal 10 program. So Thea and Celestine in a minute are going to talk through some of the kind of compliance pathways that exist in the housing production strategy. And of course, we've also talked on this rack before about the acceleration program where DLCD might do an audit of potential barriers to local development. But in both of those processes, there can come points where the model code is going to be used as a benchmark for local action. Say, if maybe the barrier is that we're, local codes for middle housing are too restrictive, the model code can be used at times as a benchmark to ensure that we are kind of reducing barriers to the production of housing. This rule clarifies how that works. Basically, it provides flexibility for local governments to apply their own codes, and really it's compared against the model code, basically to ensure that it's achieving comparable outcomes, right? Are you allowing similar scales and intensity of development and comparable local land use regulations that don't create unreasonable cost or delay to development? And so this kind of outlines some provisions around how that comparison happens, but it doesn't just mandate that every local government has to use the standards in the model code. It provides flexibility to customize those to local circumstances. And then this last rule really gets at mandatory application. So this is a function that's prescribed in ORS 197335. We've talked about the Housing Acceleration Program before, and basically it's an agreement between DLCD and a local government to take actions within our respective controls to achieve, to reduce barriers to development. At the very tail end of that process, if that agreement isn't being entered or complied with, there is this LCDC enforcement order that's kind of this tool of last resort to comply with housing laws. One of their authorities is to apply a model code or a model ordinance directly to housing development as basically kind of a developer's remedy until that local government comes back into compliance. So that's what this rule articulates and outlines and says, all right, here's how it applies, here's what it means when it applies in that type of situation, and here's how it will be lifted, basically upon completion of LCDC's enforcement order. So those are the four rules that we have in there. Kind of, again, this is a first draft with the expectation that we're also working on refining different aspects of the model code and that type of thing. And of course, we'll be refining this as we get into, the final stretch here. I'll pass it back on over.
Thanks, Sean, finding my mute. All right, thank you for that framing. I'll sort of pull that thread through as we talk through the compliance pathways for the housing production strategy, action selection, and the ways in which those model codes and model ordinances play in this part of the program. Just as a reminder, the housing production strategy is a plan of action to address the needs, so both the key needs that we talked about and all the other needs that were identified in the contextualized housing need. Like those compliance pathways that we talked about before, these are sort of distributed across levels of prescriptiveness. I'll walk through one by one, but I'll try to be quick. Like I said, most of these new provisions actually do point back to the model code, which we just talked about. And so those set the standards that cities have to reach either by comparison or by direct adoption of the model code. Two really important things these are not settled. Like all of these rules is very first draft. We are eager to hear your feedback about both the content and sort of the tools that are applied here. Another, again, this is only providing partial satisfaction of the housing production strategy. Cities really do still have to select non-land use actions to address all the other elements of their housing need, and that's based on the current rules that are in the system. So this is sort of a supplementary program that attaches to the current rules, the existing rules. It doesn't undermine or take away from that in any way. So finally, just a note about language. This team has been colloquially referring to these actions in this section as land use actions, which really has no definition in rule or statute. So we were reviewing as a team with the urbanization team as well, and it really became clear that what we were calling land use actions are essentially the same as land use efficiency measures. So we opted to pull that term across the whole program. So we are now calling the actions in this section land use efficiency measures, which are a subset of actions that have this sort of more focused application. So we'll start with minimum standards here. I think we can go to the next slide. Starting with the proposal for middle housing, we know that despite statewide legalization, really significant barriers remain on the local level to developing actual middle housing in a lot of cities. So this provision liberalizes the standards for this development, increasing development feasibility in areas that currently allow middle housing by pointing to the standards that are in the model code. A question that I just want to plant here is how and in what ways might this this provision impact design choices that support livability? You saw some notes about this in the document. Is there an impact of applying this in such a sort of broad swath requirement? And are there potential unintended consequences? Are there mitigating actions that really might help to balance that requirement? Ben, I'll let you decide if we want to have conversation here. I definitely want to hear what the folks have to say.
Well, we'll pause and maybe let's take two, Shannon and Brock, and then we'll keep going.
Thanks. I'll just be quick. I'm concerned about when historically more diverse neighborhoods that have been single family and at lower price points have some higher density come in that can result in displacement. And I think that's often the case when homes are, developed more densely and targeted towards higher income earners. I think that there's a pretty clear through line in that kind of displacement happening. And I just think that there are some innovative policies, land use policies by some cities, right, where to prohibit that, you get density bonuses for having units be affordable that are at least a portion of the units, for example. So just thinking about like really specific strategies in some instances that could circumvent those harms. Thanks.
Right, and those incentives, you kind of lose that leverage, as we've talked about, I think, in other venues. You lose that leverage for those incentives to work if you apply it very broadly. So definitely point taken.
Thanks, Dave. Brock?
Yeah, a couple quick touches just on comments that I made in other meetings, and then an additional piece here. But one, as I had noted during the last HOG meeting, I don't think that the minimum standard here is aligned with the requirements and statutes for when these can be applied. Rebuttable presumption would be allowed there, right? But that kind of, not to mention the issue that I brought up at the COWTAC meeting with Ethan on Thursday about how this affects housing capacity analyses. But specific to Rule 200 sub 3, what I want to hit on here is whether or not this is truly a rebuttable presumption. I think when we're considering whether or not to add these amendments, one of the things that we need to think about is whether or not any cities are actually going to try to rebut this, or if this is a rebuttable presumption in name only that functions essentially as a minimum standard. And while that can be difficult to quantify, I think the best thing we can do is look to recent examples of similarly structured rules and see how cities have responded to that. Um, the most similar and most recent rule like this that has been adopted is Rule 320 in Division 12, subsections 8 and 9, about the way that your land use regulations work in climate-friendly areas. You have subsection 8, which is basically the presumption that would need to be rebutted, and 9 is the alternatives outcome-based pathway that you can use if you rebut the presumption in subsection 8. And while there were a lot of cities that had a lot of concerns with the baseline assumptions in 8, not a single one has tried to implement the rebuttable presumption in 9 because it's too complex. And so I think if we apply that same logic to this, if a city, maybe they have good middle housing or multi-unit housing development standards already, but if they're not confident that they're going to be able to adequately rebut that presumption, they might just have to go through and just say, hey, you know what, this is working, but we're going to scrap it so that we have legal certainty here, right? And so, the question being, right, if we are creating an impractical rebuttable presumption, it's basically going to function as a minimum standard. And so I would be interested to hear from cities whether or not any of them are confident that their existing development standards would live up to that. Additionally, I think there's a problem wherein if you're applying this directly, then and that becomes kind of a more or less, maybe not explicitly, but kind of a safe harbor of like, yeah, you've done enough around removing development barriers to these types of housing. There might be a lot of other barriers to these types of housing that exist that are not specifically related to development standards and that might be locally unique. And so if we're applying this on the front end and saying, okay, yeah, this is, more or less enough, right? We might be disincentivizing local governments from taking actions within their control to remove other barriers that might not be directly related to what exists in the model code. I know there was a lot there, but thank you for the time.
All right, Alexandra, you snuck in, so I'll go to you and then I'll broadcast the question and I'll hold that for jurisdictional folks to ponder on. Alexandra, jump in.
So I'll just kind of touch briefly on the kind of question that Brock asked about local governments and whether or not a lot of these are practicable. I think that's something we're still kind of crunching the numbers on. I think, between all of the different housing production strategies and minimum standards and all of that, it's a lot to crunch through. And many of our jurisdictions are still working on that. I think kind of the feedback that I've received so far, and I'm not a practitioner on the ground, is that some of these really are not reflective of market trends and things that we're seeing on the ground. And that's going to make it so that cities somewhat universally have to rebut the presumption instead of going with the rebuttable. With the presumption, they're going to have to rebut it because it's not reflective of what we're actually seeing on the ground. It's not reflective of the trends that we're seeing in housing building. It's not reflective of those kinds of things. And so I think that's the biggest challenge that we're having of like the flexibility of the rebuttable presumption is wonderful for some of our jurisdictions where, perhaps they don't have the capacity to, do the work for the rebuttal. But if it is not based in reality and not based in kind of the market trends and things like that, if it is based in kind of our goals and not actual on the ground economics, it's not as helpful. And so trying to talk to a lot of our jurisdictions, I've got feedback from some of them that it's kind of workable, and from a lot of them that it's not quite there yet, that they're just not quite reflective of what we're actually seeing on the ground.
Thanks, Alexandra. Okay, thank you. Thea, let's keep going.
Sure.
Yes.
Forging ahead. We can go to the next slide. Okay, I'll talk about this one quickly. This is sort of a relatively small one-time intervention. This minimum standard around unit size, it simply allows cities to calculate density with bedroom count rather than unit count for affordable housing. So incentivizing larger and family or larger household size units at lower price points by giving cities credit towards those density goals. We can move to the next slide. So as we reflected in the notes, I believe the multi-unit housing is critical to meeting Oregon's housing need. We all know this. This provision sets standards that align with the model code again, if a city chooses not to rebut. So this is, there are some standards here that you can refer to in terms of the content. Staff really have two big questions. One, the way this is developed, it provides several options, or at least two options. And while flexibility in allowing flexibility for cities to respond is a really key goal, is this type of rule construction too complicated? Does this actually introduce sort of more of a analytical burden rather than just emphasizing flexibility? There's that balance there that we're always trying to reach. So curious to hear feedback on that. Also, just to point out, this proposal doesn't expand the land on which multi-unit development is allowed currently. It just sets standards that align with the model code within those areas of the city that type of construction is already legal. So curious to hear thoughts about how that's framed, about whether this achieves the goal. If folks, there's been a lot of conversation about this, and just want to encourage people to keep chewing on that one. It's I'd say still need to land, but this is the proposal on the table for the moment. We can go to the next slide. So since the exercise here was really focused on land use measures, there are kind of a limited number of interventions available as compliance pathways to address accessible and adaptable housing need. Non-land use actions here are really critical and effective in responding to that need. And it's an important moment to emphasize that cities are still required to do those, to assess, reflect, and adopt those non-land use actions per the existing rules. So that said, this safe harbor does really incentivize the development of properties with accessibility features using those bonuses that are outlined and developed in the model code. And going to the next slide, I think we can wrap up here. I wanted to make a note about affordable housing, because there is currently no proposal for a compliance pathway for affordable housing. Again, really want to put a lot of emphasis here that this doesn't diminish the centrality of the goal as an element of both affirmatively furthering fair housing or that requirement specifically in the HPS. It just sets up that need to be addressed through locally determined or contextual actions. There's no language in the rule currently to reflect this, but DLCD will provide guidance to adopt the incentive structure described in the model code, similar to the accessible and adaptable incentive structure. It includes bonuses, and I think can be a really effective lever. Conversation open about whether this should stay as guidance or sort of have a sort of higher level of prescription. And we can move on directly from the HPS section. We can go to the next slide. There's one other part of this program that we haven't spent a lot of time talking about since last November, probably, but want to bring back in the conversation around the acceleration program and the ways that the compliance pathways in the housing production strategy interact with the acceleration program. It's a question we've been thinking about a lot since last year. We kind of held this off while we were constructing sort of a framework for these compliance pathways. finally narrowing in on a structure, and we've proposed some amendments in the audit element that support the policy objectives and the structure of the compliance pathway. So essentially, the audit in the department is required to determine if code standards have been achieved and to identify any barriers in their implementation. So the new section in the audit will specifically refer back to those compliance pathways in the HPS to ensure that those standards are being met in a city's code. It sort of leaves some flexibility in how a city gets to those standards, but it makes the specific expectations around these certain actions very, very clear. The staff is also considering whether the addition of language in the acceleration agreement also connects responsive actions to those deficiencies in a way that that works both with statute, with the current rule. This is still under discussion, but effectively, you know, this would primarily be accomplished through the audit. I think that is essentially all that I need to say about this welcome conversation here. Just a note that because two of the compliance pathways in the draft rules are minimum standards in the HPS, if a city doesn't adopt those are not going to go into the performance-based acceleration program audit, no matter what those production numbers look like. But if a city doesn't take those actions, they'll be referred into the acceleration program through another route. So there's a lot of accountability here. The structure is, you know, we're building that structure based on these new compliance tools, and interested to hear back from folks about how this program stacks up when sort of viewed all together. So I'll wrap up that presentation there and hopefully give us some time to have a conversation.
Great. Well, thank you. Kathy, let's start with you. There's a number of questions just starting, you know, how's this all landing on folks? Any clarifying questions? What do you love? Where is this falling short? There's a lot of direction you can go as we think about this all in context. Kathy, jump in.
There's two comments I need to make. One on accessible housing. I don't understand why you're talking about 4+ stories. All the discussion we've had has been 4+ units. And that's because that's when the fair housing requirement of adaptability kicks in. So I'm wondering if that was a mistake, and if not, I need some explanation of why 4+ floors. The other thing is that on affordability, there absolutely needs to be some standard. I've been harping since the beginning on the 0 to 30%, which we have not talked about how we are going to meet. And I think 30 to 60% is in the same category. It's going to be very difficult, and we're not providing any standards as to how that's going to be met. And there's also no discussion of for sale housing in those affordability categories, which is crucial to creating wealth for those populations. Thank you.
Do you want to take that? So starting with 4 stories versus 4 units.
Just a clarifying question. Is that in reference to the model code, or is that more related to the, yeah, you want to clarify that, Kathy?
There's a specific discussion of 4+ floors in the I think it was in the accessible housing section. And as I said, we were talking about 4+ units.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, this might be referencing a bonus provision that does exist in the model code. So, Kathy, as you know, accessible and adaptable housing is something that is regulated by building code, right? And that's where they set the requirements for, you know, type A, type B units, that type of thing. And so we don't, you know, obviously we don't have statutory authority over building codes. What we do have statutory authority over are bonuses and incentives, right? So one of the things that's in the model code are different provisions around inclusion of additional type B or type A units where they might not otherwise be provided. And the way to do that is by providing additional like flexibility or additional kind of intensity, you know, basically like development bonuses to incentivize the provision of accessible or adaptable housing where it might not otherwise exist. One of the important ones that we have for type A units in particular, in the model code at least, is we set kind of a threshold basically allowing pretty permissively for apartments up to about 3 stories. It's really conducive to wood framed apartments, one of the cheapest construction methods that basically exist for housing, period. But to kind of incentivize the further provision of type A units, we provided a bonus to add, say, an additional story to that. And that provides a pretty valuable one for the inclusion of type A units where it wouldn't otherwise be required by building codes. Does that make sense?
It does. We were also talking about 4+ units as being the minimum at which the Fair Housing Act kicks in.
Yeah, and there's also bonuses too for the inclusion of type B units where they wouldn't otherwise be provided as well.
Right. Is there a place where I can find the bonuses set out?
Yeah. I believe we linked to the model code. Was it in this agenda that we linked it into as part of the reading materials, or was it the previous one? In any case, I can share with you the link to the current draft of the model code. We're still working on calibrating all these different standards, but they do include provisions around, all right, you know, if you're going to build, say, a type B unit, you get some flexibilities on these different types of things.
I would like to see that.
Yeah, it incorporates it too, even for like a detached units, like there's some
Right.
bonuses that are built into there, so.
Right, so that's a follow-up. And then the 0 to 30 and 30 to 60%, is there a comment?
I mean, we also have affordability bonuses built into there too, but I think I'll defer to the rest of the team to talk about affordability more globally.
Yeah, certainly room to develop out that that affordability compliance pathway more, and those specific suggestions are really helpful, Kathy. I think that, you know, the aim is definitely to provide both home ownership and rental options at that very lowest level where we know the market won't build them. So certainly part of the consideration, definitely part of the larger program, and you know, still trying to identify the best sort of tool to apply to really specifically elevate that goal.
And did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, Thea said this several times in the meeting today. I'll just reiterate it. The compliance pathways are just a opportunity for local governments to be certain in the actions that they take to meet not all, but some of the obligations that they have under the housing production strategy program itself. That obligation maintains, if we did not have any of this conversation about compliance pathways, cities would still be obligated to take actions in response to an affordable housing need. That obligation is sharpened in some ways by articulating the floor or the safe harbor or rebuttable presumption or minimum standard that a city might be held to in terms of taking land use efficiency measure actions to meet that need. And in the context of affordable housing, one of the reasons why this is proposed as guidance is there are a limited number of land use efficiency measure tools at a local government's disposal to meet the obligation that they might have identified in their contextualized housing need for affordable housing. And so that necessitates local governments to look elsewhere, non-land use related actions to meet that obligation that still remains regardless of all of the conversation that we have been having today.
All right, thanks, Ethan. And then Kathy, what was your third piece? It was point of sale. What was the sale piece and home ownership?
Ethan just addressed it. I was just saying, or somebody addressed it. I was just saying there was no discussion of construction of 0 to 30 or 30 to 60% as being required for both sale as well as rental. So there's some wealth building, which we were prioritizing.
Yep. Great. Thank you for that clarity. Alexandra?
This is going back to the same slide on accessibility and specifically the larger cities provision with the 4+ story buildings. I think, larger buildings, higher density, something that many of our cities are interested in. I think the bigger question that we get to is, and this is a running theme that you're going to hear from me all this entire time, is feasibility. We have a number of cities that have market studies that say that they just really will not see 5+ story buildings pencil in their jurisdiction anytime in the near future, just due to rising costs of building those things. So, even with some level of incentive, that may not be something that's possible. And I think that's where I get some pause on these things, is like, our market conditions continue to worsen as we look at housing production and in ways that cities, cannot adjust for necessarily. And so there are certain things where I get a little bit more pause, especially when we get into, your higher story buildings, where it just may continue to not be feasible, due to things not within a city's control.
Can I speak to that a bit? Because those studies are actually part of our process for refining the model code and part of our thinking, actually, specifically with the multi-unit, and really inform a lot of the decisions that we made. Good. Is that okay that I do that?
Yeah, jump in.
What?
Jump in, Sean.
Yeah. Because this is an important thing. We actually reviewed a lot of those market studies that we were seeing in the context that were happening a lot in relationship to the implemented the climate friendly areas. And one of the big things that we were seeing was that certain types of multi-unit's a huge category of different development typologies, all the way from like wood framed construction. Previously, middle housing was considered multi-unit until we've defined it to be something different, all the way up to like steel and concrete, right? And those have different like market dynamics that affect their feasibility in different contexts. And really where we saw a lot of where market studies were pointing to was saying, hey, when you're talking about like higher, like really tall buildings, like 6, 7 stories, oftentimes including podium construction, those types of things, those tend to not really pencil, especially right now, except in the most valuable kind of markets, the most, like, central cities, that kind of thing, downtowns of larger cities, that type of thing. But when you're talking about the feasibility of like wood framed apartments, those are actually quite feasible and actually something that we've really focused on and honed in on in the multi-unit code. Like, this is a housing type that is actually feasible in a lot of different contexts and markets. And we should really try to structure the standards to ensure and make them as feasible as possible. What I can say is if it is illegal to build multi-unit apartments, you're guaranteed to never see them. So, I mean, that's just something to keep in mind, right? As we're thinking about this, part of the reason why we don't see multi-unit apartments built is because it's illegal on most lands, basically, to build it. And the places where it is illegal, it ranges anywhere between difficult to impossible to build as a result of a lot of different factors that can influence development, some of which are market, but some of which are also in our control, like development standards that we've been really evaluating and thinking about a lot in the model code.
So, Alexandra, you name what you're hearing and experiencing. Sean, I appreciate your contextualizing it. Is there? I'll ask you to follow up, Alexandra, or if there's a recommendation for something that you would shift or recommend, as other than kind of the warning call of it may not pencil out.
I mean, even if it is, I will not say that any of my cities who have concerns about this have said, this is not something that they're interested in or are interested in prohibiting. They're just saying that this is not something that is feasible at this present moment. And it's not necessarily even pointing towards, wood versus podium construction, like fully acknowledge wood construction, far more affordable. I think the real concern is that like they need housing types of all kinds in all areas of their cities. And even if we're just looking at kind of those denser urban cores, that perhaps is not providing that level of accessibility to folks across the map. And so, it remains a high level of concern because even then, in order to make those units accessible, you're going to need elevators and that's going to increase your building cost. And cities are not necessarily always in a position to provide incentives, even if the building is legal, even if it's legal to build a multi-unit thing, that they are not in a position to provide incentives on top of that to make it pencil. Things like SDC deferrals, whatever other step that may not be something that is available to them to make those, many story buildings possible. obviously a 4-story is much more affordable and, easier to construct. And even once you get to 5, you can probably do it. But once you really get to those 6+, and I will say most of our jurisdictions start flagging things at 5.
Yeah. That's good.
Throw out nothing in here is like, certainly nothing in the code is saying you have to build multi-unit apartments, right? I think everything that I've been reviewing so far is around, well, we should allow them to exist so that way it can be possible to build them. And I'll add to, we've also thought a lot about where does it make sense to focus our time and energy, because the additional costs of construction really start to add up the higher you go, right? At 5 stories, that's when you're required to have an elevator. At 6 stories, that's when you're basically required to have podium construction. And that makes it less and less valuable to go taller. And so we didn't focus a lot of our energy there. We focused really on 3 and 4 stories, where there's pretty broad feasibility and tends to be a pretty cheap way of constructing apartments, at least. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you both. Brock?
Yeah. So one thing, Sean, in your last response, you were mentioning the CFA market studies. I'd seen the one from Ben that came out a while back, but I've been trying to get the other 8 from the transportation team since the last LCDC meeting in June, and still have not been able to. I know they probably have a lot on their plate, but if you have those studies available, it would be great if we could send those out to everyone in the group. If not everyone wants it, I'm specifically requesting it. Just so that we can look through that, because the results for Bend were frankly pretty abysmal. I think garden apartments were just about the only thing that had any chance of penciling, of the types that were considered for it. And additionally, those only looked at multifamily. They did not look at any middle housing types that would potentially be developable within CFAs if they met the minimum density standards for that area. So that would be really great to see.
I mean, exactly. That's why we focused in on garden apartments, right?
Well, but I mean, the study looked at about 9 types of housing that could theoretically be developable, and not but middle housing was not included in any of those. There were only different variations of apartment types that were evaluated in that. But regardless, if we could get those 9 studies, that would be fantastic. But additionally, kind of with what Alexandra was talking about, when we're talking about needed housing, right, we have spent the last 20-ish months talking about type, characteristic, and location. The one piece that we have not really spent much time on, and to Alexandra's point, is subsection 4 of 1978.018, right? That subsection 1 is type, characteristic, and location. That subsection 4 is that, okay, this type, characteristic, location, that is needed housing. But when you're making a needed housing determination, market factors are required to be a part of that consideration. And so I just want to make that clear, because I don't think that is aligned with a 40/20 rebuttable presumption for most cities. I think that probably overestimates the need specifically for, for multifamily housing in particular, especially for small cities, by quite a bit. So just note on that, and then CFA market studies would be fantastic.
And I'll defer to my colleagues to speak to that. I do think it is important to point out, you're definitely not going to see apartments if they're illegal to build,
Right. No, absolutely.
So let's go, and then the 9 studies, Brock, was that an ask of the LCD?
Yes, please.
Okay, so just captured as such. Brian?
Changing the thread a little bit, because we've covered there's a lot of technical detail in what was just presented in this section. Let me lower my hand. I want to bring it back just a bit to housing mix and the rebuttable presumption that, in a nutshell, 40%, the standard is 40% in multi-unit, and then 20% middle, and then the remaining 40% being in single unit detached. And I went back to the Echo Northwest memoranda that was part of the HOG work group, and their suggestion was for larger cities, for those numbers to be slightly lower, a recognition that yes, these rules and this process should shift the housing mix towards more affordable housing types. multi-unit, and middle. Because the vast majority of housing, I'd say like around 60% outside of the metro area for these kind of medium-sized cities tends to be in single unit detached, which is less affordable. Therefore, we're having these discussions around shifting the mix. And so Echo's recommendation was 50%. So in other words, bend the curve. We need to bend the curve and start planning for more attached and middle housing types. Totally agree with that. For the sake of meeting housing need, creating a greater range of housing types, greater diversity of housing types, and the hope is around affordability. But there are downsides too to over assuming that housing will be actually constructed. And so the Echo came in and said it should be around 50% and have that be a mix of both multi-unit and middle. And what we're seeing here is a higher percentage total. Now it's 60% and it's 40% multi-unit, 20% middle, which is almost the inverse of what is being constructed in these marketplaces in outside of the metro region, say. And I have concerns about that going beyond that 50% that was recommended by Echo Northwest. And I think the opportunity cost, and Echo even noted, like, yes, we need to move in this direction, but do so with caution. There are a lot of unintended consequences in essentially underestimating the total land supply that we need and having these unintended consequences that could lower the total amount of housing production in these areas. And so I'm concerned that those numbers and those under the rebuttable presumption are just too high. I'm just curious why we're not keeping it within that recommendation. There are references to the Portland metro region. And when I look at housing production per capita, when I look at levels of rent burden in the Portland metro region, they're not necessarily, how would I say it? That's a different housing shed. It's a different set of conditions. There are different economic factors. There are different reasons why people are living in different places across the state, and taking that Portland model and essentially applying it to the rest of the cities in Oregon has me concerned. And I would recommend going back to what Echo Northwest recommended, and using that as the model rather than taking that model and then moving it even further towards the multi-unit and middle housing types. And I think that gets us to that sweet spot that avoids some of those unintended consequences. I'm just concerned about total housing production across the state. That's the emphasis.
Thanks, Brian. Ethan?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to some of your points there, Brian, about like the why. And I think this is DLCD feels that this is a core tenet of the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis program, which is that we are planning towards a future that is more truly accurate to the need that is present in the state. And the approach of not relying upon or influencing the type mix conversation with what is achievable and feasible is actually an intentional decision as part of the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis program, right? When we're talking about, and that thread is carried through in terms of how the allocations of the housing production targets happen, that is the needed housing allocation. Those are all geared towards what is the true number and types of units that are needed in the state, and we plan towards that number and those needs. And we take the actions in response to realize that future.
And can I bring this back down to earth a little bit too, in terms of like market factors? Because like I want to emphasize, I've announced this before. I am now a homeownership as a consequence of middle housing legalization. Prior to middle housing legalization, we would have said, well, the market doesn't want it. It doesn't provide it because it was illegal to build. But I was able to buy this unit in a triplex that was built as a result of middle housing legalization for $290,000, which is I don't know of any new construction single detached unit that exists anywhere in the state that sells for that amount. And I'm in Portland. I'm in the Portland, like Portland, Oregon, not the Portland metro. Right. So I think it's like also important to realize like this diversity sets the stage for enabling people to actually realistically be able to afford different options that are just illegal right now. Right. So like that's just something that's really important to keep in mind. Like that's a real thing that happened from middle housing legalization.
Okay, thanks, Sean. So, Brian, did you have just a quick
Well,
response?
different issue. These are different issues. I don't disagree with Sean at all. My concern, though, is that we can plan for it. Do we have a good factual basis that says that it will get built? That's my concern. And so I don't disagree at all, Sean. Yes, we should do all of these things, but as we know, these things can come at the expense of one another. And so I'm not arguing that this needs to be single unit detached till the cows come home or the hogs come home. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, are we planning too much? And that's the judgment call we're trying to make here.
Yep.
So I just want to be clear that I'm not against middle housing, not against affordable home ownership at all. There are unintended consequences in this as well. I just want to raise that awareness.
Yeah, I mean, so yes, Ethan, jump in, but I think
I'm sorry, Ben.
you put a point on your point, but Ethan.
Yeah, I apologize. In a vacuum, like we have to think about it holistically. If we're planning to meet a number or a metric or a unit type mix, that necessitates the response to actually make that development feasible. And good news, there's a housing production strategy program that asks cities to do that exact thing of think through the actions that they're going to take to try to meet that future.
Good, thanks. So I do want to make sure we have some time for closing. Shannon, we haven't heard from you in a while. Brock, maybe throw your comment in the chat if you can. Shannon, jump in, and then I want to do some closing, make sure folks see what's coming next.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate everything about this conversation. And I will say, we are, just to echo what's been said, we're trying to build a future we haven't seen yet. Right? We're trying to build something that's not here quite yet. And that's going to be uncomfortable as a matter of course. And we might not get everything perfectly right as we go. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, or it isn't worthwhile, or we don't have the right people on the very broad team of cities and DLCD and housing developers and legislators, like working together, leaning in together to do the next right thing. That's going to push the needle. So I just a little caution, right, that we don't keep our future bound by our past, especially with innovations around things like building components off-site while infrastructure is being put in and then delivering a home at a more entry-level price point, for example, and some like huge work being done just on that thing, which is no small thing when so much of our state is zoned for detached, right? And there might be other kinds of constraints that need to be overcome, certainly with regard to infrastructure, some innovative thinking and partnerships between cities and developers that maybe are just starting to exist or we're trying to spread more broadly but are not common practice yet, right? Those things are just like, let's hold a little space for innovation. Thanks.
John. So Ethan, in our last 2 minutes, you want to kind of walk us through the timeline, next steps, process, and any closing thoughts?
Yeah, that's sure thing. Yeah, thanks, Ben. So as I think we all learned in this meeting, there are lots of various elements of this conversation, and not all of we don't have the time. And even though these meetings are 3 hours, we do not have the time to get to all of the discussion. So what that means is, please, if you do have thoughts in terms of particular citations, wordsmithing, questions about I don't really like I see your intent, but I don't understand how from the rules you're achieving that intent. Like all of that commentary, please do send that to us. Written at this point in the process, that written commentary is absolutely invaluable to shape, inform, and build out the rest of the rules, because we are speaking in draft rule language at this point in time in the process. We've had those conversations about conceptual, theory. We have paper words on paper at this point in time. And so please do direct your comments to those proposed rules, and track changes, red lines, those are A+, types of commentary at this point in time. So we will take, I don't know, maybe it's like a little pause on the Rulemaking Advisory Committee process to move into a more formal version of this process, which is the actual public comment period that is necessitated by the Secretary of State rulemaking process. So we will take all of this feedback that we've heard from you all today, and the cows and the hogs, and incorporate that into a draft set of rules that will be published for the purposes of informing a public hearing by the Land Conservation Development Commission. That publication will happen October 1st. Then the written comments that folks October. I think we are slated for, and Vice Chair, this will be news to you, but 4 hours on your agenda to discuss this rulemaking process and hold that public hearing. Then we'll come back together as a Rulemaking Advisory Committee just 1 week after that to digest, review, consult, discuss that public hearing and that next version of rules. All of that is leading to I will get to that, Miranda, 1 second. All of that is leading to a adoption hearing in front of LCDC on December 4th. There's one item here in kind of that bar at the bottom. The public comment period closes November 7th for public comments. So that is both comments at the Land Conservation Development Commission public hearing on the 23rd of October, any written comments that you all have for either this version of rules or the one that's published on October 1st. We've got, November 7th is really the close of that time frame. So we are in it now. It kind of shifts to a more formal process on October 1st, but please do not wait until October 1st to send those comments. Today, tomorrow, next week, next month, all of them are good.
Right. Well, 12:01. Almost great. So I'll let y'all go. Thank you for a robust conversation. Appreciate everyone. Have a wonderful day, and we'll see you soon. Take care.